Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. My name is Amanda Feinstein. I'm the founding and former director of the Oakland Promise Brilliant Baby program and currently working as a consultant to strengthen child savings account initiatives in California and nationally. It's been my pleasure to work with the organizers of today's webinar. And before we begin, I want to acknowledge Dr. Willie Elliott, Dr. Trina Shanks, and Dr. Tom Shapiro, who are the trifecta of brilliant leaders in the asset building field who organized today's webinar. You'll be hearing from each of them in the panel discussions that lie ahead. Today's webinar is about answering the question, what does economic security look like and how do we get there? This is one of the most critical questions of our time. The depths of economic and racial inequality in our country is unacceptable, and we must figure out and implement the systemic policy and resource solutions that will result in meaningful and lasting change. A central premise of today's discussion is that the solutions to poverty and the building blocks for economic security for marginalized individuals and communities must include new opportunities that increase income and build assets. And furthermore, that neither income alone nor assets alone are sufficient to achieve lasting economic security and upward mobility. Our first panel today will be moderated by Professor Trina Shanks from the University of Michigan. And this panel will focus on the empirical research and data that point to the importance of aligning income-based and asset-based anti-poverty strategies. The second panel will be moderated by Deborah Ellen Glickstein, who is the Executive Director of New York City Kids Rise. And this panel will deepen our understanding of how income and asset policies can be integrated to effectively support economic security and upward mobility. First, we're going to start with some opening remarks from the sponsor of today's event, Jennifer Kelly is the Policy Director at the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation. And following Jennifer, we'll hear some framing remarks from Dr. Michael Sherraden, who is the George Warren Brown Distinguished University Professor and the founding director of the Center for Social Development at Washington University in St. Louis. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Jennifer.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the University of Michigan and Dr. Elliott for putting this panel together today. Like Amanda mentioned, I work at the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation, where we believe that all people, regardless of their race, gender, or geography, should have the opportunity to achieve economic stability, mobility, and prosperity. In the spirit of our founder, Ewing Marion Kauffman, we seek to build inclusive prosperity through a prepared workforce and entrepreneur-focused economic development. We believe that by working together, we can champion ideas and support solutions designed to improve education, boost entrepreneurship, and help communities and individuals thrive. Yesterday, we re-released our America's New Business Plan, a nonpartisan policy roadmap to create a more inclusive economy by building a prepared workforce and concentrating on this focused economic development, which you can find on our startusupnow.org website. Again, like I mentioned, we're honored to support this important conversation today on economic security. And I look forward to hearing from today's panelists on the innovative ways we can use policy to fight poverty for all. Thank you.
Michael.
I'm delighted to be here today. Welcome, everyone. This program entitled, What Does Economic Security Look Like and How Do We Get There? This is a highly important topic on which we are, in fact, making progress, sometimes haltingly over time. We're fortunate to be hosted by the University of Michigan School of Social Work, which is the #1 ranked school of social work in the country. And also, I'm proud to say, my alma mater. It is fitting that we are meeting here today. Social workers have historically led in the long struggle for economic security. During the early period of capitalism and industrialization, poor people, a very widely applied category, were typically locked up in local poorhouses, and dependent children were locked up in orphanages. These were often horrors with no way to get out. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, reforms led by social workers began to create the alternative policy of what was called at the time outdoor relief, meaning financial support in the community. For example, the first White House Conference on Children in 1910, hosted by then President Teddy Roosevelt. At that conference, the attendees, which are largely social workers, made a purposeful decision to get dependent children out of orphanages and into the community. Social workers, led by the women of Hull House, were responsible for creating the first mother's aid laws in the states starting in about 1912, 1913, which provided cash payments to single mothers. This was called outdoor relief. State policies later led to federal policy for aid to families with dependent children, provisions in the 1935 Social Security Act. These policies are far from perfect, but we should keep in mind that the prior policy of institutionalization was in fact a horror. Today, this stream of policy development includes emerging policies for child development accounts, also originated by social workers, to build assets for children's futures. Child development accounts, sometimes called child savings accounts, will be a topic at this conference. Let me thank the conference organizers, the University of Michigan, Professor Willie Elliott and Trina Shanks, who planned this meeting, along with Professor Tom Shapiro of Brandeis. Each of these colleagues has made strong and lasting contributions. Tom is perhaps best known as the co-author, along with Melvin Oliver, of the acclaimed book, Black Wealth, White Wealth in 1995. This was the first major academic study to put race and wealth together with a careful analysis of the role of social policy. Willie has become a national leader in asset building policy, starting with children. He has focused on effects of wealth on identity and expectations and implications for educational success. Trina has studied long-term impacts by race of the Homestead Act of the middle 19th century. She has studied asset building and community development, and she has specified a theory of wealth and child well-being. These are each very notable scholars who are leading our discussion today. They're valued colleagues, and each is exceptional. I would like to point out that each also earned their PhDs at Washington University of St. Louis, where I've spent my entire academic career. Tom was there before I arrived, and Willie and Trina were my doctoral students. Today, I learned far more from them than the other way around. Willie directs the PhD program in social work and social science at the University of Michigan, where I studied years ago, and I remain grateful for that excellent education, and it's a pleasure to return to this school and university. Sometimes it is helpful to adopt the very big picture. Although not always understood, social policy is the single largest category of public expenditures. If we include health and education, social policy represents well over half of US federal and state budgets. To say this another way, social policy is, in a budgetary sense, the main purpose of government. Or to put this in political terms, social policy is the primary purpose of the modern state. We have come a long way from poorhouses and orphanages. In this regard, it is perhaps puzzling that the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State are viewed as senior cabinet positions, while the Secretary of Health and Human Services, who oversees far more spending than all of the other cabinet secretaries combined, is seldom mentioned in the news. Unfortunately, the purpose and effects of social policy are largely underappreciated. We tend to think of social policies as public expenditures that are helping people or being good to people. But in fact, the major function of social policy is to make sure citizens have the conditions and the resources to provide for their security, stability, growth, and development. This is a very practical matter. Social policies stabilize families and communities and channel investments into human and social development. To say this another way, it is not primarily human kindness that has led to these policies, but rather the realization that social stability and development are the foundation for a successful nation. Humans are, of course, our greatest resource. In the absence of social policies, people are far less likely to reach their potential, achieve stability, and contribute to the social fabric. or to spur economic productivity and engage in a vibrant democracy. Social policy is easy to take for granted and to underestimate, but it is fundamental. Only when humans are secure and functioning can they reach their potential and build a strong society and economy. Turning to our topic today, the presentations focus on social policy to distribute income and build assets. This topic may sound specific or narrow, but these policies represent the single largest category of public expenditures, far exceeding even healthcare. I take the view that these are the most important public policies in modern states, and we are here today to pay more thoughtful attention to these policies. In this regard, it is sometimes assumed, almost always without empirical evidence, that income support policies and asset building policies are in some kind of competition with one another. This thinking is far less useful than it may sound. We know from common sense that both sufficient income and sufficient assets are necessary for human stability and social development. To oversimplify, humans must eat today and also invest for tomorrow. Those of us who are fortunate to be in the middle class know this very well. We enjoy major income and asset building supports. We have income support through both employment and social programs, most notably the Social Security Act for retirement, disability, and other supports. In addition, we enjoy large tax benefits, a form of public expenditure for our capital growth, home equity, and retirement funds. It should not come as a surprise that low-income people have the same need for both income to survive and assets to build their future. The only sensible policy direction is that all people should enjoy sufficient income to survive today and asset accumulation to reach their goals tomorrow. And as we shall see in the presentations today, this also applies to low-income families, just like everyone else. It will also be clear in today's discussion that, woven into the history of our nation, racial injustice is a dominant presence. Policy proposals for adequate resources cannot ignore this fundamental history and current pattern. Policy proposals must purposefully and affirmatively aim for racial fairness. This too makes practical sense. White people soon will not be the majority population, and the country is not going to function successfully until white people stop hogging all the resources. To ground ourselves in a solid applied perspective, we will also hear today from Melvin Carter, the mayor of St. Paul, Samuel Hammond, the director of poverty and welfare policy at the Niskanen Center, and Connie Evans, the CEO of the Association for Enterprise Opportunity. I have known Connie and her excellent work across 4 decades, and we are in for a rich and informative discussion. I'm honored to hand off next the Zoom and the screen and the microphone to Senator Bob Casey of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has a very well-designed child development account policy and the largest number of children with CDAs or child development accounts in the nation. Today, all Pennsylvania newborns automatically receive a CDA with an initial deposit at birth. This policy was initiated under Joe Torsella, a Democratic state treasurer, who said it was his proudest contribution. And today, it is administered with equal enthusiasm by Republican State Treasurer Stacey Garrity. The larger point is that asset building starting with children has bipartisan political support, even during a highly partisan period. In addition to government deposits, the Pennsylvania CDA spurs parental savings, and the state has been creative in using other funding streams to build assets for all children. Senator Casey has proposed a version of children's accounts at the federal level, and he can proudly use his state as a very effective and sustainable example. We next welcome Senator Bob Casey.
Thank you so much, Michael. I'm actually going to jump in because Senator Casey has to do a vote, and so he's not going to come in until 12:30. So okay. I will introduce the first panel, and hopefully when he joins, he'll be able to weave into the conversation. But thank you for that introduction, so I won't have to introduce him as much when he does join us. So good morning, everyone. Thanks to Amanda for welcoming us. Thanks to Jennifer and the Kauffman Foundation for funding and supporting this work. And thanks to Michael for those wonderful remarks. He gave us some history, he gave us some inspiration, and he also introduced just about everyone. So we're doing really well. Thank you so much, Michael. As we think about achieving greater economic security today, I also want to think about ways that economic insecurity has been conceptualized. And then I will introduce our wonderful panel that you, I'm sure, came to hear. If you look at the international poverty line as set by the World Bank, it's living on less than $2 per person per day. And there's 1 billion people estimated to be living below that very extreme standard. And if we look at the work of Luke Schaefer, at least prior to the pandemic, about 1.5 million US households and 1 out of 25 families with children were below the standard of $2 per person per day. If you want to go to what the US federal poverty line, it's around 27,000 for a family of 4, and the poverty rate for households was 11.4% in 2020. But again, if you fall a little bit above or below that line, you really aren't that different in terms of economic standing. If you look at things that the Federal Reserve does around whether or not you can handle a $400 unexpected expense, only 63% of respondents could cover with cash or cash equivalents, and 37% of the US population would not be able to handle that $400 unexpected expense. And if you look at information from the Survey of Consumer Finances, the median net worth for the country is $122,000. And that sounds okay, but there are huge disparities by age. So those below 35 compared to those above 55 are doing very differently in terms of their wealth and net worth. If you look at African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans, they're doing much poorer, sometimes 1/10 or 1/8 that of white or some portion of the Asian population. And if you look at family configuration, those who are single parent households look very different than those who are married households or households with no children at all. And even beyond these formal definitions, it really doesn't capture the lived experience of those who are facing economic insecurity, whether that means living paycheck to paycheck, not being able to make ends meet, the month is longer than the money, facing material hardship, or just being stressed out trying to manage debt loads and finances. And that isn't just those who are poor at the bottom of the income distribution, but probably spans across the income distribution. And these stresses that come from not being able to have the resources you need to reach your highest potential and to make the choices that you want can stress out marital relationships and relationships between adults, as well as stress the parenting relationships and relationships within children. And so I, for one, am very excited to hear what the panelists to say, how we can go from a point where so many families face economic insecurity to a point where more and more families face greater economic security. So it is my honor to introduce quickly our esteemed panel. Amy Castro is the Associate Professor at the University of Pennsylvania in the School of Social Policy and Practice. She's also founding director of the Center for Guaranteed Income Research. She's been invited today to give the income perspective, focusing on what families need to survive. I'm going to go through and introduce everyone, so when the time comes, we'll just follow in sequence. But if you have questions along the way, please feel free to put them in the chat or the questions. And we may not get to all of them, but when we have a response at the end of this, we also will give people, we will try to respond to all those questions and comments. So after Amy Castro, if we aren't joined by Senator Casey before, is going to be William Elliott, Professor of Social Work, Director of Joint Doctoral Program in Social Work and Social Science at the University of Michigan, and also founding director of the Center on Assets, Education, and Inclusion. He will give the assets perspective, focusing on why families need something to live for. And then our final panelist is Professor Thomas Shapiro, David R. Pokros, Professor of Law and Social Policy at the Heller School of Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University. He has been speaking and writing on racial inequality and public policy for decades, and he will speak on actually changing the narrative from thinking about income and assets as separate and independent strategies to combining them in ways that support all households. And when he joins, Bob Casey is the senior US Senator from Pennsylvania. He's held that seat since 2007. He's also been invited to make remarks on the overall topic of economic security and is likely to mention his 5 Freedoms for America's Children initiative, which includes the freedom to be economically secure. So I'm on pins and needles to hear what everyone has to say, and I will now turn it over to Amy Castro. It's all yours, Amy.
Great, thank you so much for having me. I'm going to take just a quick second to share my screen. All right. And can someone who is on the tech side there let me know if everything looks all right?
You're good.
I'm good?
That's
Okay,
good.
cool. Give me just a moment. Despite a lot of time with COVID Zoom, we've had a couple snags today. Okay, great. So thank you so much for having me. And thank you for that wonderful introduction. I also just want to say, as somebody who sort of does a lot of public speaking on unconditional cash, the framing on this is talking about sort of how do sort of income supports go hand in hand with wealth building or asset building supports. I'm super excited about. I'm constantly yelling about this in the cash space. So it's a real treat for me to be in a space where I don't have to make that argument because the argument's made for me in the way that it's framed. So thank you. Just going to jump right in and sort of talk a little bit about why are we experimenting with cash. So one of the questions I get often is why now? Don't we know that cash works? If people are poor, like poverty by definition is lack of cash. And if we want to remedy that, we give people cash, right? Which is obvious, right? But then the question becomes, why run experiments? What is it that we have left to learn about what families need when it comes to poverty? So first, and actually my slides are advancing, give me 1 second. Okay, so first, what do I mean by unconditional cash? So within kind of the umbrella of cash supports, I'm talking specifically about unconditional cash. And within this category, we have three basic terms that you'll probably hear a lot in the press or just sort of in general. So first, two things that are features of all three of these categories is first, no strings attached, meaning it's cash that you receive because you're human and you were selected into the treatment group or you met the criteria within the policy proposal. That also means that there's no means testing, which means there's nothing that you have to do to receive it. You don't have to participate in a workforce program. You don't have to participate in financial literacy, financial coaching, et cetera, et cetera. Within this, we have first UBI or Universal Basic Income, which is what most people are likely familiar with given Andrew Yang's presidential run. It was a key point of his talking points in his policy platform. And what UBI refers to is a fixed amount of recurring cash that's provided to all residents, and it's enough to keep them above the poverty line. Second is guaranteed income, which at the moment is primarily what I study. I say at the moment because I kind of consider myself agnostic as to the best path until we have more data. And a guaranteed income is a fixed amount of recurring cash that is provided, that is not provided universally to an entire group of people. Basic income, or a BI, is a fixed amount of recurring cash that can cover basic needs. Now, the key place that there's sort of differences here is between the UBI component and the guaranteed income component. Biggest difference is that a UBI is exactly what it sounds like. It goes to everybody in a set state, county, country, choose your geographic variation. And we actually have not had a true UBI experiment here in the United States, despite how it might be reported on in the press. The closest we got was the child tax credit, but even that wasn't quite universal. So history, I'm going to run through this really quickly. Despite kind of this new momentum in the press and new momentum among policymakers and this renewed interest in cash, it's actually a very old idea. Thomas Paine wrote about it at The Birth of Our Democracy. It was the subject of Dr. King's last book. And then we had a slate of experiments in the 1970s and the early 1980s experimenting with unconditional cash and negative income tax experiments. I won't go into that, even though the researcher in me basically wants to give you a verbal lit review on it, but I will hold off. Fast forward in time, late 2017, 2018, we had a new resurgence in the idea of cash. Reason being is that on the heels of the Great Recession, we saw tremendous losses in wealth, which I'm sure that Willie's going to talk about shortly. And it really spurred this question among mayors and among researchers of saying, we keep trying to solve old problems with old tools, and we're not making a whole lot of progress. Families are working more and they're making less. We've got to try something new. That led to the Stockton experiment, which was the first new experiment in modern US history, alongside the Magnolia's Mothers Trust, which was taking place in Jackson, Mississippi. Fast forward in time beyond that, and we're now at a point in the United States where there are over 150 pilots with unconditional cash. 150 was the number that I saw the last time I checked, but it could easily be more than that at this point. And of course, Dolly Parton, who has been experimenting with unconditional cash in the face of wildfires and environmental catastrophe for quite some time. Okay, so purpose and logic. Like, why are we talking about cash when people are also wealth poor or asset poor? Okay, first is that I want to be really clear that we really see unconditional cash as a response to income volatility, not the racial wealth gap or the gender wealth gap, although these things are tied together. For most who are in the audience likely know, is that we have a dynamic in the United States where people's income is consistently moving up and down each month. That is a feature of capitalism. It's not going to go away. But what's new is that that income volatility is moving farther up the income ladder. So we're talking about gig workers, adjunct professors, in many cases, contingent laborers in the legal field, people who cannot predict their income. We know that income volatility not only shows up as poor public health indicators, but it also locks people out of safe financial investments because they are sort of then read by algorithms and then read by markets as being an unsafe bet, right? So markets work on predictability. If your income is going up and down each month, even if you're making six figures, you are not seen as a safe bet and you're then locked out of safer financial products. Second is flexibility. Cash is flexible and needs are flexible, right? So, here in Pennsylvania, during the winter months, the cost for utilities spikes really high, and that becomes the thing that matters the most for families is keeping the heat on in their home, right? But when it comes time for back to school, the needs are going to shift. Does my kid need soccer cleats? Can I afford to put my kid on the football team? Do I have the funding to be able to buy them the notebooks that they need for class, right? And so cash is really the only thing that can meet that dynamic elasticity in individual household budgets. The other component is really human rights and human capability. So unlike our current safety net, which functions on the idea of a benefits cliff to where you matter as long as you fit this little tiny band of eligibility. And then the minute you make $1 over, we're going to kick you off as though suddenly you're in the middle class when you're not. The idea of unconditional cash functions on the idea that you matter because you're human. You don't matter because you perform in the market. You don't matter because of what you do in the home and performing unpaid care work per se. You matter because you exist, which is a fundamentally different orientation than the way the US safety net is set up. And I won't bother to go through all the details on findings on outcomes, but I'm happy to provide that if people have questions. So within our center, we're currently running 31, as of this week, 32 experiments with unconditional cash around the United States. We have around 17,000 people in treatment and control. This is a quick map of all the places it's taking place for us. And we're just a little sliver, right? We're just a little slice. We're part of a much larger movement around building sort of evidence towards cash. So the question becomes why, right? So I get this a lot from donors and from policymakers. Why are you running experiments for policy proof of concept when we know that it works? The snarky side of me will instantly say, how do we know it works? I haven't even released the second year findings from Stockton yet, and I know what they are, but I definitely know you don't know what they are. So how do we know it works, right? And so on the face of it, yes, there is a logical component that we know that it works, right? But we also have really large gaps in the research around how cash can support individuals and how cash can support families that we would argue need to be answered in order to move to a spot where we can think meaningfully about pairing unconditional cash policies with financial inclusion, financial coaching, and asset building strategies. Some of these gaps are things like dosage. What amount of money maximizes impact based on cost of living? What are the key times of change? Are there key moments that we need to infuse cash within the lifespan or within the calendar year? And then, of course, geography. How is unconditional cash experienced differently in different policy subsystems where there might be more supports in one area than another? So for instance, I'll use St. Paul as an example where we're running an experiment with Mayor Carter. There are a lot of supports there for young families. So the $500 in that experiment is going to go a lot farther in terms of childcare than it is, say, in California, some of the cities we're working in there, where there's just not a lot of supports for childcare. And then, of course, policy pathways. We need to test to figure out how do we re-engage populations who have not only been disinvested in, but have been targeted for predatory products over generations. They have no reason to trust us. Even if we have a beautiful policy proposal around income supports or unconditional cash, why would they trust the government, or why would they trust me as a researcher if they've been systematically targeted for predatory lending? These are some of the key questions we're asking. And then finally, I just wanted to end with this. And I hope that people bring up more questions in the Q&A. I strongly encourage people to ask questions in the chat and whenever we open up for that Q&A component. The final thing I just want to touch on when we're thinking about cash, and this matters too for, I would also say for financial coaching and any type of asset building policies that we want to put in place, is that social constructions drive the US welfare state. We know this. It not only drives the political cycle, it not only drives messaging, but it drives the ways that we layer means testing with shame and blame that function as disincentives for people to apply for benefits that they actually qualify for. And if we continue to move forward with unconditional cash purely through a research lens or purely through a policymaking lens, without interrogating those social constructions like the myth of the welfare queen, and all of these assumptions that poor folks don't know what they're doing and they just need more education, right? We're going to migrate those myths off of the US welfare state and onto unconditional cash, right? We cannot move forward without interrogating and dismantling these racialized narratives. So I'll close my remarks with just two examples. We know that implementation gaps generate enormous inequality, right? So first, the other reason we're kind of experimenting with cash in the policy space is because these experiments are incredibly expensive. By the time we're done with all the experiments in our portfolio, and this is just my center alone, people in the treatment conditions will have received $160 million in unconditional cash. That's the amount of money that we're talking about here. That's incredibly expensive. So before we move forward with rolling that out across an entire state or across the US, we ought to know more about how it functions best, right? And what we need to build out in terms of implementation. And when I think about implementation gaps in the present generate inequality in the future. So if we look back to the New Deal, the populations of women, people of color, and zip codes that were locked out of those benefits generated the racial wealth gap, generated and contributed to the gender wealth gap that we are now living with and trying to undo. So if we don't understand implementation around cash and we don't figure out how do we meet families' needs best, we're going to create a new set of social problems that we'll be dealing with 30 years from now when I'm supervising dissertations and trying to retire. Second example in the present I would give would be the CARES Act. We experimented federally, both Trump and President Biden, with unconditional cash in the form of a child tax credit and in the form of stimulus payments and expanded unemployment insurance. But when we look at those early rollouts, particularly of the CARES Act, we saw gaps with mixed documentation status households, returning citizens, and the very poor. The very people who would benefit the most from an infusion of cash were among the last to receive it, which is of course sending another communication to them that they don't matter and that government does not have their best interest in mind. Ergo, when we do have that perfect policy or program rolled out around unconditional cash, they are less likely to engage with it because they're experiencing legislative invisibility and being locked out of the system. So I'll close in saying, it's an exciting time to think about unconditional cash and asset supports. I'm tremendously thrilled to be at this point in the research space where there's so much momentum, but I also just want to carefully note that the momentum in public discourse is moving faster than the data at this point in time, at least in the world that I sit. But one of the things that I think is the most exciting is that politicians are willing to lead with data at a moment when science is constantly being called into question. So all these experiments that I mentioned are for the most part tied to elected officials, which is exciting because they're leaning into science and saying, how do we talk about pushing on public discourse while also doing that and generating data from policymakers? Thanks so much. I will pass it off to our next speaker.
Thank you so much, Amy. You did exactly what you're supposed to do. I will now turn the mic over to Senator Casey. We look forward to your remarks.
Hey, well, thanks very much. I'm sorry I'm a little late here, but I hope I didn't change the program too much. And we're grateful that you gave us a chance to appear a little bit earlier. So I'll get right to my remarks. But I want to thank everyone for this opportunity. The Kauffman Foundation, Michigan State University, so many people who make this possible. I know that Professor Elliott will be hearing from, and grateful for the work that so many people did to make this possible. I'll get right to it. I've long believed that the United States Congress and the executive branch over many years, over many administrations, have not made children the priority that we should have made them a long time ago as a matter of federal policy. So I developed a proposal, which I call the 5 freedoms for America's children. And the first freedom is the freedom to be healthy. And I don't think I have to fill in blanks about what that means for the steps we have to take on children's health care, even with the good work that Medicaid does every day and the Children's Health Insurance Program and so many other options. But we have a lot more to do to make sure that every American child is covered. And at last count, more than 4 million do not have health care coverage. And secondly, the freedom to be economically secure. I'll talk more about that, but also the freedom to learn, early care and learning, obviously pre-kindergarten education, quality, affordable childcare is part of that. If kids learn more now, they will earn more later. That's not just a rhyme. It's the truth is so evident from the data. We have done nowhere near enough to invest in early learning. And then the freedom to be safe from harm is critical to protect our children from those who would cause harm, predators in our society, who I believe should be aggressively prosecuted. And we can't ask states and local jurisdictions to do that without much more federal help, federal resources. And certainly the freedom from hunger, which of course has been so evident, and the challenge so significant in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. But the one I'll focus on for the remainder of my remarks will be the freedom to be economically secure. Every child in America should have the opportunity for economic security and to earn a living wage when they reach adulthood. This is not possible for so many children because they don't have not only the opportunity of benefiting from the other four freedoms, but this freedom in particular, because we're not investing enough in families raising children. Now, one of the best things the United States Congress did in 75 years was the American Rescue Plan, for so many different reasons, but principally because we took three existing tax credits and made them much more generous, much more expansive, and therefore much more impactful on the lives of children. The earned income tax credit, the child tax credit, and the child and dependent care tax credit, which many of us shorthand as the child care credit. We know the benefit that we've heard over and over again, but we have to keep repeating it, of the expansion of the child tax credit. Just to give an example, in my home state of Pennsylvania, 2.2 million children benefited, or I should say the families of 2.2 million children benefited. And what were they using that $430 or $40 a week or a month for? They were buying food, paying for groceries in the grip of the pandemic. They could use that help right now. And I have to admit, as a Democrat, as much as we should lift up and celebrate the fact that we expanded the child tax credit, thereby reducing child poverty by some 40% over those months of 2021, we failed. We failed in not getting this expansion continued, at least for another year. And I would argue we should make it permanent policy. By the way, we had zero help from the other party on this. Not a single Republican in either chamber voted for the rescue plan, and therefore denied children raising families the opportunity to get this help. But in addition to that, we should make permanent the child independent care credit, the child care credit. Families have most recently benefited from that when they filed their taxes just this past April, in April of 2022. We're still awaiting the data to see how many families took advantage of that. But families just for this year would have thousands of dollars extra to pay for childcare solely because of that expanded credit. But in addition to all that, we have to do more to lift up families throughout the country. One of the things we can do is to help families have a savings account for children. As everybody from Franklin Roosevelt to Professor Elliott would make the point about having an opportunity when we enact policy to give children something to live for, not just life itself, but something to live for. So that's why we need a national children's savings account. This would be seeded with $500 of federal government dollars for working families, for their children to use later for several different options. One, they could use it for post-secondary education. Two, they could use it to put down a down payment on a home. Third, they could use it to open up their own business. And of course, they could use it for long-term retirement savings. Whatever they choose to do, this is something that every child should start their life with, a foundational savings in the life of that child. The typical young American household, headed by someone less than 35 years of age, had only $14,000 in wealth without this policy. My children's savings account would double young Americans' starting wealth position, allowing them access to a secure financial future. So this is something we need to do. This is something the federal government should do. We can't just point a finger at states and say it's up to you to provide these opportunities. I know that Pennsylvania's done it. I know that Maine and a few other states have done it. But the federal government has to get into the game here and put dollars on the table. And $500 per child is not a lot to ask of the federal government when you see the lavish and really, I would argue, obscene tax breaks that corporate America has been getting, not just in the 2017 tax bill, but for 40 years, and very wealthy Americans have been getting for 40 years, most recently in the objectionable tax bill that I didn't vote for in 2017. So we have to make sure that we're lifting up families to the same degree, at least, and I would argue much more so, than we're lifting up huge multinational corporations and very wealthy Americans. I know we're tight on time, so I'll stop there, but let me thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for engaging in these debates about how we can lift up children and families and literally have a stronger economic foundation for the nation, have a more secure nation in so many ways. And I want to end by saying I enjoy serving in the United States Senate with Senator Debbie Stabenow and Senator Gary Peters from the state of Michigan, not to mention those I know in your congressional delegation. But thanks so much for this opportunity, and God bless your work.
Thank you, Senator Casey. Do you have time for questions, or do you need to run off and do a vote or something else?
We are, so I'm kind of pressed for time, but
okay,
maybe if our staff can transmit some answers to those questions, we can do that.
Okay, thank you so much. Have a good rest of the day. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much.
Okay, Willie, I'm going to turn the microphone on to you.
Well, I've had all this time to hear Michael speak, Amy speak, and Senator Casey speak, and now I'm feeling kind of insecure about my remarks, but hopefully they will add something to it. And what I don't get, I'm sure Tom will add to. So I'm just going to jump into it. I know I'm at 10 minutes and 15 seconds, so I'm going to be a little bit long. In talking about the New Deal, I think President Roosevelt provided us with a simple but powerful definition of what economic security should look like in America when he said, "Liberty requires opportunity to make a living decent according to the standard of the time, a living that gives man not only enough to live by, but something to live for. Without this opportunity," he continued, "life was no longer free, liberty no longer real. Men could no longer follow the pursuit of happiness." From my perspective, when Roosevelt talks about a living decent according to the standard of the time, he is foretelling what income policies are designed to do, establish what the standard of living is within a society. In describing income and assets in the poor, Michael Sherraden said, "Income refers to the flow of resources in a household, a concept associated with consumption of goods and services in standard of living." While vital, income policies by themselves will never address the root cause of poverty, even if temporarily eliminate the negative symptoms such as starvation or homelessness associated with being poor. Pause for a second and just picture starving homeless kids. You can see why policymakers, researchers, media, and the public feel compelled to focus their attention on income and choose to wait on assets. To free our minds and come to a different way of combating poverty, we must understand how we define the standard of our time is a moving target. Income approaches importantly address inequitable conditions, helping level the playing field so everyone has the same foundation from which to catapult themselves into the future. But if social policy does a good job of providing everyone with the same income foundation, at the same time they are reducing hunger, they are changing the standard of the time, making, for example, $15 per hour the new poverty wage as the markets adjust and prices increase. And so new And so new income policies will always be needed, and thus conditions for pursuing asset policies are unlikely to arise under the narrative income first, wait on assets. Another narrative is that poverty is essentially a problem that people lack income. Thus, solving poverty is as simple as increasing income. But as Sherraden said, very few people manage to spend their way out of poverty. The idea that poverty is an income problem is reflected in US poverty thresholds and guidelines. When establishing poverty thresholds and guidelines, the US government uses dollar amounts to indicate the least amount of income a family needs to meet their basic needs. The concept least is very important because this helps shape public conversations about poverty. It is reflective of America's perspective on the purpose of a social safety net, only enough to live by. We go a step farther in America by denying people enough income to build assets and prevent families receiving public assistance from building new assets. We do not stop there, however. We also require these families to get rid of most all their existing assets, making it more likely they will fall back into poverty if they are even able to exit it. No wonder poverty is cyclical. And because of this narrative that poverty is solely an income problem, legislation like the War on Poverty is doomed to fail. Like the narrative that poverty is an income problem, the narrative income first is also doomed to fail. It is not that income approaches are not important or needed, quite the contrary. It is that they are insufficient by themselves for solving poverty. To end poverty, asset researchers suggest that income approaches must be complemented by asset approaches. While income provides the foundation from which to catapult families out of poverty, assets are the inertia that empowers them with the capability to not only move out of poverty, but pursue happiness. This too is a change in narrative from the focus of social policy on moving people out of poverty to positioning people to pursue happiness. What the last 200 years has shown us is, if we take the approach of doing income first, we will never get to passing asset policies for the poor. We should end the narrative today. It is delusional. It is not how our politics work. It only helps shape a narrative that income is needed and assets are a nice extra. Assets are the epitome of giving families something to live for. Squirrels store up acorns in the tree for long winter season. Assets are stored up income. While income can elevate poverty conditions, cure the symptoms of poverty, it does not attack the root cause of poverty in America, the inability of some people to build assets. When families have assets and a flat tire occurs or a washer breaks down, it does not mean falling into poverty. They simply draw on their squirreled away assets. Sorry, changing pages is hard. Equally important, having a store of assets gives people the means to begin defining what their future will look like, what I call tangible hope. It is tangible and thus a determinant of behavior and not wishful. Tangible hope is determinative behavior because people pay attention to and act on things that they perceive can make a difference in their lives, something Michael echoed in his book as well. Assets give people a stake in the future. That is, the power to purchase a piece of the future today. Another way to say this is, assets allow people to clearly see how they will be able, for example, to pay for college, buy a home, retire comfortably. Assets are real money stored away today for future purchases, making the future tangible as though I can touch it, experience it, even own a piece of the future today. In this sense, assets allow us to purchase stock in our future selves. When we begin to understand this, we understand that future orientation is not innate, but something we purchase. Asset ownership makes us feel secure enough to begin to plan for our futures today. I've often heard people argue that Americans are not poor like other people are poor, given the higher standard of living in America than in other countries. This is usually a rationale for providing less basic income support. But what Roosevelt was telling us is that in America, poverty is not to be defined by whether you have enough to make it through the day. In contrast, in America, poverty is to be measured by whether a person has something to live for. Poverty in America is defined by our inalienable right to the pursuit of happiness, the right to be able to pursue a better future for ourselves and our kids. Similarly, it means that economic security is not only limited to whether you can pay your bills today. No, economic security is measured by our capacity to plan for our future selves. The future is the domain of assets. Today is the domain of income. It is the richness of our country in its institutions that allow us to set a different standard for what it means to be economically secure. As a child, I grew up poor, evicted often, living in hotels, homeless at other times, while eating seemed optional, not mandatory for survival in our house. I ended up dropping out of high school, as many kids like me do. Being poor in America is hard. It is a mistake to downplay that reality, and thus the supports income provides are not to be replaced by asset strategies. But the hardest thing I found about being poor is not being hungry. And what is almost always overlooked in today's poverty conversation, though it seems most quintessentially American in spirit and capitalistic in nature, is a desperate feeling when you're poor that you have no tangible hope, no future to plan for. What has made the United States of America a destination is not that you will not experience hardship, but even in the midst of hardship, you are given the right to have a better future if you but work for it. It is the opportunity to bet on yourself that leads people to America. In fact, when immigrants set out for America, they understand that they will have to suffer untold risks and hardships. However, these risks and hardships pale in comparison to attaining the tangible possibility of a better future. And while it might be vogue to downplay the importance of the American dream nowadays, it is our belief in this dream that has carried us through our toughest times as a people. This is not a dream about making it through the day. It is a promise that we can have a better tomorrow. In closing, the inertia that has catapulted Americans forward comes from more than having enough money to pay the bills each week. It comes from the inalienable right to the pursuit of happiness, which in a capitalist society is inseparably tied to a person's or family's ability to accumulate assets. Economic security in America requires both income, enough to live by, and assets, something to live for. However, to enact significant social welfare policies, let alone policies that combine both income and assets, will require us to free our minds from what is considered possible in a current political landscape and create a coalition big enough and strong enough to demand change to better reflect our ideals. We should no longer settle for political victories when families need tangible victories that change things in their life that matter to them. This is not possible if advocates of income and asset approaches do not join and understand. It will not come without a willingness to fight those who guard the status quo. That's the end of my remarks.
Thank you so much, Willie. You did an excellent job keeping the conversation going. And now I will pass the microphone over to Tom Shapiro.
Thank you. It is, it's with a lot of humility to have the absolute honor to share a platform with everybody here. Willie started his remarks by saying he wasn't sure there was much left to say. After Willie's remarks, I'm not sure much should be said after the sharing of the heart and the head, and I really appreciate that. I am gonna trudge ahead and start with a couple of questions or an observation, if you will. As Amy mentioned, and several people have referred to, there are a lot of pilots and demonstration projects around with guaranteed income and a whole lot of variety in the children's savings account and wealth building space. And I want us to step back just for a moment and think about why is it that we are mandated, compelled to run these varied experiments and pilots just to provide evidence to policymakers and the general public that the poor can save, that lives can be transformed, that mental and physical health can in fact improve with cash and other things. And think about how the absolute burden is on us to provide that. And the contrast, of course, will be tax cuts for the wealthy are not passed, demanding a random controlled trial. Let's see 10 millionaires suffer with no tax credits for about 10 years. Let's see another 10 have it. And let us draw what the evidence says. Did they save? Did the boat lift for everybody? All of the memes about people being self-made, all the narratives about why racial inequality, why wealth inequality, why inequality exists, and are totally tied into, I believe, that question. And the centerpode of that question is, of course, power. The second question I would like to start with is, as Senator Casey referred to, why did the children's tax credit expansion fail? There was evidence. Come on. If somebody told us I can reduce childhood poverty by 40%, why is there not uptake on that? What didn't penetrate? Why was there no constituency that demanded that it be continued? After all, if it lifted 40% of children out of poverty, let's think about the reverse. It may, not expanding it, taking it away, may have thrown 40% back into childhood poverty. So there are a bunch of questions that, to me, are related to framing and narrative. And I want to start, besides those observation question, with a number of statements or principles, if you will. And I'm going to push us. I'm going to push myself. I'm part of the us. We frame and advocate in silos. And those silos, we do that not because we voluntarily choose it, but it's a trap. Those are lanes that are set for is and change, and stakeholders are essentially single approaches or single. And part of narrative development I want to suggest is to burst out of that particular legislative paradigm. Institutional mandates are very restrictive in that way for us. What we need to help develop, on the contrary, are holistic narrative development that don't keep us in the lanes, rather that encourage coalitions. Keeping us in lanes, especially thinking about the center of our conversation today, income and assets, those lanes very rarely have intersected in our past. Even though I believe that most of us on the webinar today understand the necessity of combining them. Nonetheless, for the most part, we stay in our lanes. Economic security in that way of thinking has at least twin pillars. I don't know if there are triplets involved, but there are at least two pillars involved. And they're both fundamental, and they need to synergize and help each other. And the pillars are income, to get by, to live, to survive, subsistence, and wealth. Wealth building, as Willie and others have talked about, for tomorrow. In addition to for tomorrow, it's about agency. I would suggest that income by itself needs to be combined with wealth building to provide agency and freedom so that people have a better chance to transform their own lives in the way that their own ideals and visions and values will take them. And that, of course, takes us back, unfortunately, to positions of power that we do not have at the moment and needs to be part of narrative development. I was really happy to see Amy's slide at the beginning that sort of starts with Tom Paine and ends, at least in the current way, with Magnolia Mothers. What a wonderful through line through Martin Luther King, through Stockton, through others. That's the through line. That's the American ideal that we need to make much more concrete with narrative development about what the pilots and demonstrations are showing us that tap very deeply into those what should be deeply held American values. That evidence from projects needs to be synergistic and needs to articulate with other policies. I was also taken by a previous comment about, if you don't have childcare, it's difficult for guaranteed income to go very far. And that varies by states. And that shouldn't be a surprise or a shock to most folks. And that's what I mean by policy articulation. We need to think about a bundle, a nestle of policies about what it takes for people to have the opportunity to transform their own lives according to their own values. And I would suggest that on the wealth side, especially, I would come back a bit to the senator around child development accounts. Needs to be synergistic with not raising tuitions, with keeping Pell Grants up, moving them to standards that it actually pays for more education, and for the other upkeeps that are needed for going to higher education. Without those, a $500 is going to unfortunately swirl the drain fairly quickly and evolve into perhaps even greater student debt. I would like to end, if you will, on two related points. At least they're related to me. A North Star for this work of combining narratives and programs around both income and wealth needs to have a North Star of racial wealth equity. And I believe that we know how to design those programs. We know how to do it, at least on the modeling side. We've done it. I've been involved with a team that does it. And there are some programs around the country. I would dare to mention Magnolia Mothers again, where it's not just guaranteed income, but I believe there's a family self-sufficiency program that may be associated with some of the same folks, and other programs that combine the income and the asset approach. Finally, I want to talk about narrative development a little bit in terms of storytelling. Storytelling that centers the experience, the values, and the voices of people whose lives are being transformed, of people whose lives are being in the act of being transformed by policy, by encouragement, by the aspirations becoming much more concrete the way we are talking about it today, and we will in the next panel as well. Storytelling is not a science, it's an art. And I think we need to understand a lot better in terms of narrative development, the role that storytelling can have with different constituencies and different stakeholders. And I'm hopeful, very hopeful and optimistic about the number of different storytelling projects that are associated with demonstration and pilots as we move forward. And I think we're going to learn a lot from that. Thank you very much. And I'm going to turn it back to Trina.
Thank you so much, Tom, Willie, and Amy, and Senator Casey. What a great start to this conversation. And now we have a half hour, because everyone's on time, to actually have a conversation amongst ourselves amongst this. I have two initial questions that I'll ask that any of the panelists can answer. We'll also then go to questions that are in the chat from the audience. So please continue to put your questions out. But I just, since Amy talked about social construction and Tom talked about storytelling, in an ideal policy and social context, how would you define economic security? What would you like economic security to look like for families in the US context? Anybody wants to jump in, but Amy, why don't you go?
Did you say economic stability? Is that what you said?
Well, I said economic security, but if you want to say stability, what would, if all these things worked in the way we're talking about, what would we see in terms of what families experience in terms of their economics?
Wow, that's quite the question. You know, I think I think we don't know yet like the exact sort of architecture or infrastructure, because I think we're living through a moment in late stage capitalism that we don't yet have language for. So, you know, my students have to read a book that, you know, maybe the audience knows, maybe they don't, called A Brief History of Neoliberalism. And what I often tell them is 10 years from now, we're all going to be reading A Brief History of blank, but we don't have the word yet, right? And so what I mean by that is that we know an awful lot of how we got here. And I think we're still learning how we get out. And the thing that gets us to that next stage of how we get out is, you know, one, being willing to take some risks, right? Like we have to take risks. So I'm saying this with my science hat on. We are really good as PhDs at telling everybody how big and bad the world is. we are much less adept at actually coming up with interventions and being willing to take the risk that something might fail. So that'd be the first thing I'd say. The second component is political and moral will, and I would argue it is a moral economy question. Is saying like, budgets are moral documents. Like, do we have the political will to do the things we know that works, right? So case in point, child tax credit, right? I mean, the evidence speaks for itself, but the narrative hasn't been shifted yet in public discourse. And so on a practical level, what I would say is, we ought to be pursuing a society where it's completely morally unacceptable for somebody to work and not be able to have their basic needs met in a way that's not degrading their basic humanity or not showing up as poor public health indicators. We know that the failures of capitalism get under the skin. They show up, and we need some commitment and discipline. We have some hints as to how we get there in terms of economic stability or security. And we need more creativity to figure out how to knit them together. So probably an unsatisfactory answer. There's not 3 bullet points yet, but I think it's because we're living in a time of flux, which I'm pretty excited about.
Awesome, thank you. Tom or Willie?
I'll chime in quickly. We're seeing who unmutes themselves first. I guess it's like that contest. Can you hit the button first, or and trying to be gracious about it. What we have in front of us is an incredible group of academics and scholars who also have sometimes both feet in the advocacy and policymaking world. And I want to softly suggest that the answer to Trina's question, I think I know what our collective answer is, but I'm not sure it's going to be the same answer or the same voice or the same experience we will be hearing from people that we're most concerned about. And I just want to give one quick example. Several years ago, with a program officer from the Ford Foundation, we are in we're in downstate Illinois. We're in East St. Louis, and we're at a housing project, and it's basically a gathering around the racial wealth inequality. And we have a breakout session, and the first question to the group of mostly women in subsidized housing or housing projects with young children, first question of the group is, what would closing the racial wealth gap mean to you? Now here, I'm this professor, and I'm waiting to hear a dollar figure come back. And what comes back is, I will finally believe that society thinks I'm a human being and has treated me with dignity. Willie.
So I guess, I'm a simple man. I'm not as educated as most here. And so I pull on my experiences and, to some degree to understand kind of that. So even in that statement, I don't think that's unrelated to a dollar figure in some ways, right? I mean, so here's what I want to say. 2 things quickly to Amy's point and to your point. One is that while we do not yet know what the full bundle looks like, we do know that in the existing economy, there probably needs to be some subsidy to low-income jobs, some guaranteed type of income that supplements jobs that can't pay but so much because the services they're providing would then rise, right? There's going to be some fundamental need for that in my mind, particularly as we automate and even before automation. Secondly, and so giving people some form of additional income, low-income people, I think it could be part of that bundle. We could feel pretty comfortable that that's needed. Similarly, I think giving them the kind of things that Michael might talk about if he was, able to speak here, is that we need an institutional structure that will allow us to transfer wealth to families on an ongoing basis. And so there has to be an institutional structure in place. Now, the thing that I would argue is that, and this is more the large dollar CSAs I would talk about, or baby bonds other people talk about, there needs to be real money put into those accounts so that people can transition through life. One of the things that really helps create a large amount of inequality in society is that we don't have the same kind of funds to make the major transitions in our lives that everybody else does. So low income people need to have some of those funds set aside. I mean, these are things, and then they need some kind of financial capability, some ability when they get that money to be able to use it in the right way. And I know that sometimes, like, some people get mad about that because they think, well, it degrades low income people. No, we all need some kind of ongoing, I need some kind of ongoing training about how to manage and use my money. So I think you can, and we could probably throw in there, even though I don't know a whole lot about it, childcare, right? I mean, so I think, and we could say, well, that bundle is not complete, but we can add to that bundle as we move along. But we can feel pretty good that these are safe things to put in that bundle.
Thank you. I'll ask one more question before I go to questions from the audience. And I'll start with you, Tom, to be ready. So how does race influence economic security in the contemporary US context? And what can we do to reduce racial disparities, even if we have universal or more complete income and asset packages?
Oh, thanks for the little technical question, Trina. I love you. So this obviously is, we need a collective response and a collective answer, but I will start with a thought or two. You know, I want to go back to one of Amy's slides again, where again the word deservedness pops out, and I think that part of the way we have deservedness has been socially constructed for us and has been bought is around how productive somebody is. Deservedness also has been constructed to mean it gives us a story about why some people succeed and why others don't. And it intertwined with what the stories of why people succeed and don't succeed is an incredible amount of racialization, an incredible amount of a popular and dominant understanding of why racial inequality exists. And for the most part, without mincing a whole lot of words, it goes, you know, it pops up daily. It pops up daily in terms and in references to people not valuing education, some people not valuing education, some people not working hard enough, etc. I think we know what those memes look like. Whereas the attribution of success is almost always about self-worth, and therefore those populations deserve those tax credits. And I think that's all intertwined. I think we have enough policy chops and smarts about us that we know how to design policies with a sweet spot of an outcome in mind, where we're increasing economic security for the most, while attacking racial wealth inequality at the same time. So for me, you know, the agenda, if you will, has to be both one about individual or family or community mobility in tandem with racial equity.
Thank you. Willie or Amy, do either of you want to jump in?
I think Tom covered it. I will pass to Willie.
Yeah, I think we can leave that one there so we can get to another one. He answered.
Okay. Well, let's go to some of the questions. So Amy, there was a question for you. What arguments exist for reducing public costs on a systematic level? For example, near monopolies like PG&E, AT&T, you might want to say internet companies. So even if you give people more money, if costs keep going up because we have these corporate monopolies, what does that do? You have any thoughts?
Yeah, I will preface by saying not that kind of scientist. No, I just kidding. I could speak to it a bit. I just think there's other folks that are more well suited. I would point to my colleague Ioana Marinescu's work is a good person to read on this topic. But yeah, I mean, I think what whoever's asking the question, I think, is asking a bigger question of saying, what are the other things that we demand of our institutions because cash is not enough, right? Like I can give everyone in the United States $1,000 tomorrow, every month for the next 10 years, but that does very little if we're not also talking about reverse redlining, if we're not talking about anti-monopoly work, if we're not talking about lack of a living wage, if we're not talking about, access to safe banking, right? And so I think part of what we need to do when we're talking about assets and income is thinking about all the other institutional structures that it's a part of. So to that end, one of the key questions that we're asking in our center across all of our research sites is asking how does the infusion of cash potentially shift thinking in individuals, because we're providing money to individuals. So that's essentially who we're studying, although there are some questions on households. How does it shift the way that they view their work life? How does it shift the way they view their participation in civic life or in community? And does it lead to people asking more of their employers, right? Like, because we can't expect to supplement lack of a living wage and lack of, safe income supports by just providing a guaranteed income. That's insufficient. So, I mean, the other kind of piece I'll say on this that I think that one of the most promising aspects in terms of funding an actual guaranteed income or UBI is taxing data. And I don't mean taxing, individuals, but I mean taxing Silicon Valley and the companies that are profiting by ad revenue by selling back our data to us for all the things that we do in cookies when we're moving around the internet. That's just one idea. There's many out there. But yeah, I mean, whoever's asking is totally right. We can't talk about just income and assets and not talk about all these other structures, monopolies and near monopolies that are preventing people and creating these ceilings for upward mobility.
Okay, go ahead, Willie.
I will, even in Tom's earlier comment, I wanted to mention, like, what does the public want? And it can be different from what we're pitching. And then I will go to this comment, like, well, there's all these other things that exist that need to be taken care of. Sometimes that can really prevent us from doing anything, in rallying around anything, right? Because while we can't provide guaranteed income, we can't provide child tax credits because the banking system stinks, right? In doing these several things, it doesn't mean that we don't have to work on everything else. It doesn't do that. But and secondly, what can policy do well, easily? I think, like, there's things that policy does better than others, things we can do more easily. And so I just think that sometimes it creates inaction on our part, and we get so cerebral about things that we are not able to do anything. Lastly, I will say that when I was talking about earlier, I should mention Senator Casey's proposal actually lumped some of those things in together, because he's saying $500 per year, so it's actually more of a large dollar account. And secondly, he's talking about a child tax credit, which is kind of like the guaranteed income. And he's also talking about childcare in another section. So maybe we have some of these things, if we could ever get a coalition around these things and not allow the politics to keep us from moving forward.
Okay, this is a technical question, so I won't even presume who should answer it. We'll see who jumps in first. It's from Daphne Gluck. Can you discuss the tension between the desire to grant tax cuts that serve people who pay taxes, not necessarily just high income folks, versus cash transfer and investment and asset building policies that support people below the tax threshold? Does anybody want to answer that one? There's a tension.
I'll answer it first, because I'll answer it very not technically, right? And so somebody else can then ask the technical part of it. I think that's why we're having this discussion today in some ways. It's around narrative change. The one reason why these tensions sometimes exist, I think about, like, the opium of the people type of idea, right? That if we keep people kind of separated in their silos and give them something, then they will never rally together. The reason why we can't have political change is because assets and income people fight one another. The reason why we don't have a child tax credit is because we're debating each other whether or not should we have a child tax credit or should we have assets, these kind of things, right? We need to shift narratives around how these things are perceived, how providing a guaranteed income fits into the American dream and actually makes it more so that we have effort and ability being the deciding factor in why someone succeeds. But there's not that narrative. It's seen as something that's almost anti-American, and we need to fight those narratives.
Tom or Amy?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question's right in terms of thinking about there are some inherent tensions. There's the researcher hat in me is sort of there's a lot of different, it depends on how you're talking about funding, something like a guaranteed income, which is what I'm, talking about specifically, is that, yeah, there's definitely proposals that have to do with the tax code, and there's other ones that do not. And some of that depends on your source of funding. But the reality is, even if we were to sort of, from a policy perspective, resolve those tensions programmatically or through legislation, it doesn't remove the social constructions that we have about people in poverty versus the wealthy, right? And so the question we often get around spending data, are you, when we're talking to the press, is, are you surprised that 40 to 50% of the money in Stockton went to food? Wow. Or, no, I'm not surprised. You fool. I've been a social worker for almost 25 years. No, I'm not surprised. Right? Why are we obsessed with questions like this? We're obsessed with questions like this because we presume that the poor can budget their way out of poverty when they cannot. We don't ask the rich how they spent their dividends, is something that my colleague, Dr. West, is fond of saying, right? We don't ask those same questions. We don't hold them up to the same level of scrutiny, because to some degree, we've all internalized this false Protestant work ethic that if you just work really, really hard, you're going to get ahead. And if you don't, there must be something wrong with you, right? And so the question is correctly pointing out that we have this tension where we're pitting social classes against one another. And of course, there's racialized and gendered lenses that go on top of that as well. But this is why I'm constantly talking about interrogating narrative, and why we take so much care in making certain that we are engaging the public through a public, transparent process of science, which is terrifying, honestly, as a researcher. I'd much rather hide and kind of wait till I get to the end and everything's nice and clean, and then I can have this big thing, and that's really great, and I'll send it through peer review, right? But that's slow and laborious, and it doesn't interrogate the public, and it doesn't sort of pull these conversations out into the light where they need to be. And we can't get to the place where we can actually pass legislation around taxes until we capture the public's imagination, while at the same time pursuing science. To me, it's not one or the other, it's both. And we know that in order to create a policy window, we have to have consensus in discourse, and we have to have consensus with data. And you can do both of those things at the same time. It is possible.
Do you want to jump in, Tom, or should I go to the next question?
Sure. Let me try and be brief, because I really, I think the conversation's great, and I want us to get to as many questions as possible. First, Daphne, my fellow from Massachusetts and great colleague, thank you so much for the question. I would simply let me just make one point, and maybe it's not the technical one that you're really looking for about the tension, except that I think we should be wary of tax policy in the following space, for the following reason. Tax policy, I think, of all the policy realms that we deal with, is likely the one that is least accessible to democratic control. Tax policy usually happens with a Senate subcommittee or a congressional subcommittee behind closed doors, a gaggle of typically white guys who've been greatly influenced by their lobbyists and by their campaign contributors. Those doors are not open for us for the most part. And until policy is made more in the light of the day, and with some avenues for democratic voice and democratic control, it's a caution, I think, that we all should take very seriously.
All right. I am going to combine two questions and make this the final question, because we have to stop in about 5 minutes, and then give you guys a chance to make final statements if you want. So there's two questions. I'm going to read them both. One is addressed to Willie. Is the narrative of the American dream not part of the challenge, in that it drives capitalism, consumerism, and wealth divisions? I think it underlies the exclusive narrative about who is appropriately American or worthy of being defined as such, helping to maintain the welfare cream and other such narratives in contrast. So American dream, it's part of capitalism. Is that a problem? Similar question, and it's addressed to Amy. I would, oh goodness, I'm sorry, it went in a way, but something about the economy and inflation. Okay, what would some version of unconditional cash transfer have on our economy and inflation, and would it disrupt our economy? So is the American dream the right frame because we're in a capitalist society? And if we do some sort of basic income and let's say assets both, how might it disrupt the economy? Is that good or bad?
I'll give you the short answer. I do have a long-winded answer about that, so we could maybe the person can email me. We could discuss that more. The short answer is, I don't think the problems with the American dream. The problems with the inequality. What I mean by that is the problem is that, and Tom alluded to this a minute ago in some ways, is that we hold people to the standard. If they're not successful, it's because they haven't worked hard. But we understand here, and many of us on this webinar understand that the reason they're not successful has to do with, did they have access to, childcare? Do they have access, like all these other things that affected their effort and ability in the first place? But I think we could all say, maybe not all of us, but certainly I would be of the viewpoint that if things were level like the Protestant assumes, that institutions treated everybody the same, we had the right guaranteed income in place and the right asset things and all these other things, and it really was about effort and ability, we'd be okay with that. The real problem is that that doesn't exist, and so therefore that's the problem, because we end up interpreting it as that person hasn't worked hard, when really it was the institutional factors that affected their ability to use their effort and ability in a productive way.
Quickly on Trina, the question on inflation, what would it do to the economy? So the second thing we're often asked beyond inflation is employment, right? So if you give people money, are they going to stop working? The short answer is no. If you can figure out how to live on $500 a month or $1,000 a month anywhere in the United States, keep me posted. Sounds really awesome. Right. And I mean, of course, the data in Stockton bore that out as well. I mean, I would also say, I don't really care so much. I care far more how spending the money impacts people as humans, right? And Americans work far too much. For the in question on inflation, I would actually point to two thinkers who are absolutely the best suited to answer that question, far more so than myself. One would be Michael Lewis at Hunter College at CUNY, and the second would be Carl Wiederquist. Those are the two leading thinkers in this area. And if anyone's interested, one of the things that both of those scholars do really well is translate peer review for mass audience. So take a look at those two folks and I'll drop their names in the chat.
Tom?
Sure. So in my theorizing around guaranteed income, I want it to be disruptive. I want it to disrupt what looks like the inexorable link that defines deservedness as what people produce, as their labor power and as their gender identity. And I think that as some think, guaranteed income has the potential of disrupting those tentacles in a way that people can think differently about what work is and what their life is about, and how their gendered roles provide security or extracts labor.
Okay, since we have 2 more minutes, I will give one last question, and this would be a chance for you to give your final statements and respond to this question. So we've talked a lot about social construction and storytelling, and there's someone who says the academy doesn't really appreciate qualitative research, and how would you advise people to structure their research around things like guaranteed income and asset building? And since that's what you all do in some extent, respond to that question, and then give whatever final comment you want, because this would be it.
Sure, I'm a qualitative methodologist, so I'll jump in. There's a lot of, whoever asked the question, feel free to email me. I'm always happy to share out data, or excuse me, methodology. So I think the biggest thing is finding ways to sort of disentangle storytelling approaches from narrative data, and that there's a lot of ways that we can do that through politically purposive samples and things of that nature. And carefully designing things in such a way that we have kind of a public arm happening consistently while also preserving qualitative data internally. A real practical way, I think that you can engage the public when we're thinking about guaranteed income is to think really carefully about what parts of your research design need to remain sacrosanct in terms of methodology, and which ones are open to a PAR process or participatory action process. So things like sampling, right? Is it possible to work with CBOs and with community groups and say, hey, how should we think about our sampling frame, which is a fancy way of saying who gets the money in the experiment, right? There's ways that you can open up that process in a community-based way that brings people in rather than creating sort of a Hunger Games of research, which is often the case when we're talking about cash transfers. But I'll stop there, and whoever it is can go ahead and hunt me down, and I'm happy to share some methodology.
I'll jump in next so Tom can go last and close this out more. So I would quickly say that, I don't say anything quickly, but I'm going to say that I spend a lot of my time setting, we have RCT that's really blending some of these things together now in St. Paul that we're getting ready to kick off here soon. And so I'm doing research a lot. I'm writing in journal articles a lot. But when I public speak, I think I try to storytell. I try to make it relatable. And I think it fits into one of the reasons why we're trying to have this conference is that we need to change narratives. We need to change narratives around the American dream. The American dream is bad and good. And so what makes it bad and how can but the thing of it is so many people hold to it, understand it on some level. And so one approach is simply to say, we won't use it, we'll figure out some other thing to say. But another approach is to figure out how what we're doing fits into that narrative so that they can understand it, they can feel it, they can invest in it. That's something the other side, I'll say the other side, does very well. They connect to the average person and they make them feel like they're expressing, like the things we're talking about, a great wealth transfer is a very American idea. And we have to be willing to talk about wealth transfers and have them understand how this fits their value system. They're not changing the value system. How does it fit into their value system? We need to be willing to have those conversations and not be so above them in some sense that we're not willing to engage in that and spend the time in helping them see how this fits into their worldview. It's hard to change someone's worldview, you know? And so let's figure out how we gain back the opportunity to have these conversations in public spaces in a way that says, yes, this is American, this is what we should be doing, and being American's okay.
Yeah, thank you. I'm involved in a great new project that's been getting off the ground, and we're at a point where we're about to contract out a pretty robust storytelling component. And we have decided not to go with a strategic communications expert, but to go with the artist and the innovator and the creative. Because I think we think on the project with our partners that's the way to go. So I tend to think of storytelling as, there's an approach that looks at a graph, and I've done this in the past. It looks at a graph and says, let's pick a point, and let's find a person who is on that graph, because we need to animate it, we need to make it real, and let's make the fact come alive about the person on the graph. I think instead of scaffolding the fact, if you will, with qualitative work, I think we need to much more focus on a story that might even take the same graph and tells the story of the person who has experienced that, what their process and their dynamic, where their aspirations started from, where they are in terms of their dream, whether or not it fits on that graph, whether or not it fits on that particular piece of statistical data, and where they want to go. And it's not something that, quote, gives voice, but it's something that centers the experience of people trying to move forward, of people trying to fulfill their aspirations, and allows us better to understand what blocks that, and enters the public discourse in that way about what's really important is removing what blocks that person's movement to where she wants to go. So that's where I would stop.
And thank you to Senator Casey and his team who's still in the attendees, to Amy, to Willie, to Tom. I think that was a great initial charrette conversation. And now I will pass it. Well, actually, we'll have a break. We'll have a little break. And I think there's going to be a clock that comes on that says you have 5 minutes. So we'll have the break, and then we'll have back our second charrette at 1:40, at least our time, whatever the time we're in, at the 40 minutes after the hour. It is now my pleasure to hand the microphone over to our second moderator for the second charrette. It's Deborah Ellen Glickstein, who is Executive Director of New York City RISE. So I'll pass it over to you, Deborah, for the second charrette.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. As Dr. Shanks said, my name is Deborah Ellen Glickstein, and I'm the founding executive director of NYC Kids Rise. And I'm just so delighted to be here today with this incredible group of thought leaders who are joining us for this second session. This is a particularly kind of like fortuitous moment because last week on Friday, I had the honor to stand with our Mayor Eric Adams in Baychester in the Bronx to celebrate that every kindergartner in New York City now has a scholarship account for college or career training, nearly 70%, 97% of kindergartners in public school. And, you know, that's really exciting for many reasons. But why I wanted to share that at this moment was because so many folks who are part of this conference today have been such an incredible, important part of this moment to get us here. So, of course, Dr. Willie Elliott, Dr. Michael Sherraden, and Tom Shapiro have been instrumental in the thinking and the design of this for nearly a decade. And of course, I'm sure that there are many people in the audience who are fellow practitioners and others who have also played important roles. So I did want to just take that moment to celebrate that. And now we're going to transition from the last charrette, the last panel, to really now talk about the how and get into a little bit more of sort of the details. And so with that, I'm going to provide a little bit of an introduction, what we're going to talk about, and then introduce our panelists. So the goal of this session is really to move from explaining why a combined approach is needed to how income and asset policies can be integrated to win the war on poverty and deliver on the American dream. So this is not a dream about only making it through the day. It is a promise that Americans can have a better tomorrow and change their position in life if they work hard and have the requisite ability. So in this session, each of the three presenters will discuss how income and asset policies can be integrated and their experiences with integrating these policies as a part of a larger strategy for fighting poverty and delivering on this American dream. So after, as I said, the individual presentations, I am going to moderate a short discussion around that really is going to try to move beyond the individual local experience with integrating income and asset policies to a broader discussion on how this can be done at the state and national level with specific policy solutions discussed. And so I am going to just now shout out our panelists here. We have Bill Zavarello, who is a policy consultant and advocate. We have Connie Evans, President and CEO of Association for Enterprise Opportunity. And we have Signa Marie McKiernan, Vice President on the Center of Labor, Human Resources, and Population and co-director of the Wealth and Financial Wellbeing Initiative at the Urban Institute. So Bill, you're going to be up first, and I know you're going to give us some really important context around the current policy landscape.
So it's obvious from listening to the prior speakers what sort of brings us together, what everyone has in common here, and that is sort of a foundational belief that every American deserves a fair chance at economic opportunity, that there are long-standing structural obstacles to expanding opportunity, particularly along race and class lines, and we all are doing or believe that it is possible within a policy framework to do better, to make America better. So that's the easy part when it comes to policy. And I just want to start with a point of personal privilege and talk a little bit about some of my experience and background that I think is related to this conversation. First, I was reminded that when I was a senior in high school, we had the opportunity to enroll in a new civics course called Congress in the Classroom. And I did that, and we drafted bills. And I drafted two bills. one of which was a guaranteed income. So by dating myself, I first learned about this particular policy option in 1979. So I guess I'm kind of coming full circle on that idea. It wasn't always in vogue as it has been the last year or two. So that's great. Secondly, you know, I was a student activist in college and came to Washington without any intention of making a career in policy. I was pretty wild-eyed, and began working in Congress for the first 13 years of my life. And you know, a couple of things that people may not know about me, and I know many of you and have worked with many of you. I was a founding staff member of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. That happened in 1991. I worked for one of the 4 members who started the Progressive Caucus. And I was also fortunate to work for a former chairwoman of the Congressional Black Caucus. And one of the responsibilities that I had that year was to draft an entire federal budget to represent the views of the Congressional Black Caucus in its entirety. And that was a educational process. And the reason I'm bringing that up is we drafted that budget, and that budget still exists. It comes up just about every year. We drafted a budget not to try to pass it, not to pass it through the House, but we drafted a budget that we believed was moral and just to society. And so Michael and Tom and Willie, you would have loved it because it was a massive transfer of spending and revenues, probably to the tune of $500 or $600 billion from wealthier people to low and middle income people. I do remember, you know, when we debated that budget on the floor, it got 82 votes out of 435. So again, the point wasn't to pass it. The point was to lay out a moral framework for a federal budget. And the last anecdote about that part of my life was when I worked for Barney Frank the first time, and I said I was pretty wild-eyed. And we were talking about some issue. I must have been 23 or 24 at the time. And he looked at me and kind of cut me off and he said, "Billy, you're letting your left-wing bias show." And, you know, and I kind of chuckled, and, you know, I must admit, being told you're too liberal by Barney Frank is a bit of a badge of honor by me. And I've carried that sort of in my head over the years. But the point he was making, and the point that I want to make, is that we can have deeply, deeply held views and values and principles. But when it comes to policymaking, and in particular when it comes to legislating, that's not enough. And so, someone earlier talked about the head and the heart. Well, the heart is the uniting part. The heart is why we do what we do. When it gets to trying to impact the government, and I'm going to be speaking about the federal government, but it applies mostly to state and local governments as well. When it gets to that, it's a very different way of thinking about change, and it's a different way of thinking about how society ought to be structured. You know, there's been a lot of conversation about a holistic narrative and presentation about the world that we all want, but Congress doesn't always work like that. Now, that budget that I talked about did. That was, you know, it was a whole lot of spending on the social side, big reduction on the military side, you know, taking away a lot of corporate welfare and extending it to tax cuts to low-income people in a refundable way. But in order for any of those things to happen, you need to layer on top of that a degree of pragmatism and possibility. And so this is what I say over and over. And I think about this in my jobs inside of government in Congress or outside when I'm trying to influence Congress. You know, my heart always stays the same. My hat may change, but the I is, what goals can we agree on? How do we develop a particular policy that we also agree on? And then what is the strategy to influence the people that are in the position to make the decisions? So, for example, it's, you know, today it's May of 2022. If we'd had this talk 6 months ago, I would have said something very different than what I would say today. And if we have this talk 6 months from now, I likely will have, we would come up with a different strategy than we would today, in light of, you know, the elections that are upcoming. Because, you know, at the beginning of any policy conversation, the first threshold is which party controls the White House and Congress. And I've been at this long enough where Republicans have controlled everything, Democrats have controlled everything as they do now, although with very slim majorities, and everything in between. And advocacy begins with that. Now, Connie's on the panel with me, and one very specific example of this that I can remember is when this second Bush administration came into power, and I'm sure Connie remembers this. One of the first things they did was come out with a budget, you know, three months in, and inexplicably, they gutted, they zeroed out the Small Business Administration programs to help micro enterprise, you know, the microloan program and the prime program with basically no rationale, no data, no reason. They just didn't know about them and thought that they would just try to save a little money on the side. So in that case, it was very easy to organize because it was a specific product, a specific program with a track record, and we knew exactly where the levers of power were. It was the small business committees, and it was the appropriations committees that drafted the bills to spend the money for those programs. And, you know, honestly, as Michael made this point earlier, a lot of this asset stuff can sometimes be bipartisan, and it was. And we saved those programs because of the campaign around the country with real people talking about their real experiences. We had baseball cards that described people's individual experience. Remember those, Connie? You know, it talked about their business, how it started, which program they used, you know, with their picture on the front, and we handed them out. That was just one example. Now, and I'm going to try to finish up quickly here. That was an easier one, not because we weren't up against powers that were disinterested in helping low-income people become business owners, but because we were able to communicate around a very specific task, which is fund these programs because they help people that need help, and it works, okay? Now, the larger you get, the bigger the change you want, the harder that becomes. And, you know, unfortunately, Congress is divided up into all different sorts of jurisdictions and committees. And so when we talk about a holistic approach to anti-poverty or to economic empowerment or to, you know, dismantling racial discrimination, from a strictly congressional and or administrative point of view, that those decisions are made all over the place. And so it becomes incumbent on us as advocates, as practitioners, as leaders, not just to say, here are the policies that we need or should be, but then from there, develop specific policies in English and in legislatese, and to design a very particular advocacy strategy that unites us as a field and that targets the exact people that are in the position to help us accomplish the goal that we want to. So I think I've probably said enough, but sorry for the technical difficulties at the beginning.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Signa Marie, we're going to turn to you now.
All right, thank you. I'm going to share my screen. All right. Well, Urban Institute has been providing evidence on policy proposals to improve financial wealth and well-being in the United States States and to address lasting effects of racist policies and practices. And I want to thank Professors Elliott and Trina Shanks at University of Michigan for inviting me to speak today alongside these esteemed colleagues. And Professors Michael Sherraden and Tom Shapiro are longtime mentors to us all, and I attribute much of the field's success to their leadership, among others like Kilolo Kijikazi and Beedzi Wu. So we've heard a lot of case making today for parallel income and asset approaches, and I'm excited to share an example from my home city of Washington, D.C., where my colleague Madeline Brown created this presentation with me. When we think about economic security, we often go to income. That's the first thing that comes to people's minds. But wealth is just as important. The racial wealth gap is 3 times larger than our racial income gap, and our current safety net is based on income programs. But a real safety net of security and racial equity would include both powerful income and wealth approaches. So at Urban, we've done work to assess the cost of economic security on cities. We know that about half of all households in the United States don't have $2,000 in non-retirement savings, and that we know that this puts at higher risk of missing a housing payment, a utility payment, and being evicted. And this is a huge cost in individuals, but we've also quantified the costs to cities. So that's the importance of wealth and assets, one example. We also know that cash infusions, the most basic income supports, can go a long way in reducing poverty, especially for communities of color. We've modeled what a $1,400 cash transfer would do for different racial groups in all 50 states. And here is the data for Pennsylvania, where another $1,400 would reduce poverty among Hispanic families by 3 percentage points from 10.4 to 7.4%, and would reduce child poverty from 3.5 to 2.3%. But as I've mentioned, the racial wealth gap is larger than the racial income gap. In 2019, the typical white family had 8 times the wealth of the typical Black family and 5 times the wealth of the typical Hispanic family. And despite some fluctuations over the past 4 decades, this ratio disparity was as high in 2019 as it was in 1983 for the typical Black family. And our country's current focus on racial justice and economic security provides the opportunity to change this trajectory. And some people assume that these wealth inequities stem from lack of personal effort to improve their financial situation. But historical research and analysis show that the origins of this wealth inequity lie in the policies, programs, and institutional practices, which created pathways to building wealth for white families while creating barriers to building wealth for Black families. So we know then that we need a combination of income and wealth policies. We need to take care of today and then also think about tomorrow. And this suite of policies, many of which we've heard about earlier today, represents some of those that show promise in supporting financial security or wealth building. On the income side, we saw one of the largest direct cash transfers via the federal stimulus payments. But many localities have also used a combination of public and private dollars to augment those programs. In Washington, D.C., Thrive East of the River was one example. San Diego County in California and Lansing, Michigan used their American Rescue Plan Act allocations. Universal basic income we heard about earlier. It's a universal expansion of the safety net. We see examples in Stockton, California, and the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians Casino Dividend in North Carolina. And Amy Castro shared a map of over 150 pilots with unconditional cash flow. The EITC is another powerful example of an income program. 31 states plus Puerto Rico and DC have adopted state EITCs to boost family income. And I'll talk a little bit more about what DC's doing there in a minute. And then the child tax credit we've heard about earlier today too has been shown to be a hugely powerful tool. On the wealth side, we need to address structural barriers such as access to quality health insurance and other policies to support wealth building. They can go a long way to strengthening Americans' economic security. Nearly 1 in 7 Americans has medical debt and collections on the report. This is on their credit reports. This is the most common type of debt and collections. And we know that medical debt prevents many families from economic security. 38 states and DC have accepted federal funding to expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act, an evidence-based way to improve economic security. Some states have supported wealth building by addressing systemic issues that penalize people for savings, and that's having asset limit reform. And Urban Institute evidence shows that stricter asset limits means people are less likely to have a bank account and less likely to have $500 in it. Other wealth building tools we've talked about today are federal or state wealth building subsidies, such as a refundable savers credit or first-time home buyers credit. As Professor Shapiro mentioned earlier, these are often less debated when things are done through the tax code, and so less transparent. Washington, DC, and Connecticut have passed baby bonds programs. An additional 7 states as of today have introduced baby bonds legislation. And then match savings programs. These have randomized control trial gold standard evidence behind them. And they include child savings accounts, individual development accounts, earn to learn programs, and then also retirement accounts. And some programs combine some of these elements. For example, a new wealth building pilot in St. Louis, Missouri is a blend of the baby trust and based on learnings from IDA programs. So DC is working on both income and wealth building policies to stem economic security among their residents, while at the same time addressing the racial wealth gap. In the fiscal year 2020 budget, DC included $1.5 million to support guaranteed income pilot programs, including the Strong Families, Strong Future pilot, which will directly transfer $900 a month into the bank account of young mothers in the district. The Earned Income Tax Credit as a Basic Income Amendment Act of 2021 in DC expands the federal EITC match from 40% over the years up to 100% after 2025. And then DC has allocated $30 million to provide baby bonds. DC also has an individual development account program called DC Opportunity Accounts. So DC is really marrying both the cash, the income, and the wealth side of the balance sheet. The benefits of direct cash transfers in DC have already been evaluated through a program called Thrive DC. This was a privately funded during the pandemic, and the findings from the program reiterate what we heard earlier, that residents are using the money largely for basic expenses, while few were and who were eligible were enrolled in public benefits. And then DC is just the second jurisdiction after Connecticut to pass a baby bonds program, the Child Wealth Building Act of 2021. And in this program, every baby born in DC into households eligible for Medicaid, the hope is to expand that beyond Medicaid in the future, will receive a government-owned trust at birth with an initial $500 deposit. They will receive additional deposits annually up to $1,000, depending on the household income. And then at age 18, those funds can be used for post-secondary education, home or commercial property ownership, small business investments, and retirement savings. And so which of these suites of policies any jurisdiction might include comes down to the existing infrastructure, available funding, the financial ecosystem, and the political will. Some relevant questions to be thinking about when you think about what's right for your community is what policy levers or funding streams do I have access to? And there's many examples from other areas. Who's my target population? Who do I want to serve? What community-based organizations can I engage? And has my state addressed some of the wealth building limitations that I mentioned? And the cost of doing nothing are far too great. Our economies and societies suffer the longer we let racial inequities persist. And as I mentioned, in New York City, we documented some of those costs just for that city, and they ranged from $542 million to $1.23 billion. Thank you.
Thank you. So much good stuff there. So hopefully people have some questions. So start to put that in the chat now, because I'm going to turn it over to Connie now, who is going to talk, I think, about public-private partnerships and entrepreneurship, and give us a little bit more context. And then we are going to take questions from the audience and do the discussion. So please put it in the chat. All right, Connie, to you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be a part of this program and see many friends that I've worked with for years. I do have to start by saying that obviously I am a child prodigy, because Michael, in his opening remarks, said we have been working together for 40 years. So that had to mean that I was like 10 or something when we were working together. So Michael, it's great to see you, but leave the numbers off, okay, from now on. It's also too bad that our conversation, your remarks and mine, are so far apart, because as I listened to your opening, what I wanted to just say when I came on is like, yeah, exactly what he said. And so thank you for being such the leader in this work for all these years. I want to focus my remarks today on micro business and Black business ownership, very particular. Excuse me. And my remarks will be informed from two primary pieces of work at AEO. One of those is from our research findings that were published under the report called The Tapestry of Black Business Ownership in America. And so we had in that work just a lot of great information about wealth building, as well as the racial wealth gap. The other place that I'm going to use to also inform my comments is the fact that AEO has helped distribute about over $300 million in grants to Black-owned businesses during this pandemic environment. And we're learning a great deal, not only from our research, but from that activity of working with Black-owned businesses during the pandemic, the shutdowns, the trying to recover and coming back. The reason, and I'm glad to be here, because most of the time we don't get included in these conversations. People don't necessarily, sorry, I'm going to pick on Urban Institute and Sing Mayor, but even in your side of your slide where you talked about wealth building, there was no mention of self-employment and business ownership and entrepreneurship. And that's why we usually find one of these disconnects here when we're talking about this conversation of income and assets. The reason business ownership is so important to this conversation, first and foremost, it's about income, it's about creating jobs. Entrepreneurs create jobs, jobs provide income. So that's kind of like the basic point there. It's a job creation strategy. The second point on the wealth building, we know from research, in the Tapestry report, for example, the wealth section of our report in that research was done by William Darity, who I know we all know and appreciate. And he was able to show, for I think the second time for AEO's research, that business owners hold more wealth than non-business owners. Not only do they hold more wealth, that for Black women, they hold 10 times more wealth than their Black counterparts who are not business owners. We also know from the research that wealth building occurs more rapidly than wage workers getting to wealth. And so for a number of those reasons, we recognize business ownership as being key to policies that want to combine and support both income and wealth building. one of the pieces that, again, part of what we are coming to understand, and particularly around policy, is the policies that, you know, fall all across the board can be used to support if they are modified and you remove the barriers, and if they are designed correctly. Oftentimes what we're seeing at the federal policy level is that the Congress may pass a really good policy, but by the time it gets out in terms of regulations, the programs don't work. They are designed poorly. They are either they have no sense of intentionality to the people that they're supposed to be designed for. I won't have to go into a lot of examples. I just can use the words PPP, right? I mean, that is the classic one that was actually a good policy, but just poorly designed and executed in ways that made it not really work. We are seeing quite a number of those things. But I think what's important is to think about where should we think and look and focus on policies. I'm sorry Jenny is no longer with us on screen from the Kauffman Foundation. I had a chance to get a sneak peek with some of her colleagues of their new business plan document that she mentioned. And I teased Phil, who was on the screen at the time, how did they get into AEO's programming so well to know what we were doing? Because everything in that policy document is activity that AEO is actually now doing. And so it's gonna sound like I'm using their work, but it's really our work. But to talk about some very specific things we think are necessary, particularly in the context of growing income and assets for Black entrepreneurs. And I am being clear about which Black entrepreneurs, right? Which segment are we talking about? We're talking about taking people from poverty and using business ownership and self-employment as a social and economic mobility strategy is in the context that I think this conversation is having and that I want to continue. So one is having access to opportunities, and what kinds of opportunities. When we look at what happens to many Black business owners, they are primarily focused in low wage and low production segments of industry. And so oftentimes it's because they're using what skills and what knowledge they have. So one of the opportunities that we should be recommending and pushing for is access to new trainings, new skill building, so that they can gain the capacity to actually, and credentials, to actually be able to start businesses that are in higher productivity, higher revenue segments of the economy. So that's one type of opportunity that we know is necessary and could actually help. Another opportunity is opportunity to funding. Usually, excuse me, usually in the conversations around business ownership, it's always access to capital, which means access to credit. Well, again, what we have learned by passing out grants to Black-owned businesses is that the idea of having permanent capital, I actually was struck by Amy's comments and other comments about cash. And it's doing exactly what we see happening in entrepreneurship when we are giving out grants to support businesses. Now, again, a lot of people, I mean, usually before the pandemic, you hardly could ever find a grant program anywhere for an entrepreneur or business owners. But what we found now, we've now completed a full year with one of our private partners in their grants program. We gave out $15 million, and to 10 million of that has now been out for a year. When we went back to survey over 1,200 Black business owners who received those grants, 99% were still in business. Now, this is during all of this shutdown and closures that we know we had in the Black business community. But those $10,000 grants were really very meaningful in keeping those businesses open. The smaller group, little under 300, had completed 6 months at the time of the first year being completed. 97% of those businesses after 6 months were still open. And so one of the things that we are looking to do at AEO is to use the word again from the first group, to experiment, to really experiment looking at what about other values in terms of dollar value can be seen from, getting small grants in the hand of Black-owned businesses. I'll speak to one more thing quickly before I wrap up around something that Willie Elliott said. He used the word hope. And I didn't hear all of what he was saying about how hope was attached to the cash, right? And when we have hundreds and hundreds of stories from these entrepreneurs who receive grants, talking about what it did for their business, how they used it, et cetera. But they talked about hope, the hope it gave them. And I'm not one who's been that big on hope. I'm going like, it's like when President Obama ran for the first time and it's like, where are your policies? You keep talking about hope. And I kept waiting for the policies. And so I've learned it, right? I've learned that what the value of hope means to people who are trying to move, not just upper mobility, but just trying to move and make progress in their lives, how valuable hope is. So we're looking at doing some testing on how do you use small grants in terms of capital to support business owners? What does that policy look like? And is there a way to insert hope into that policy? We think some of the policy has to do with trust. We're doing research on building the barriers in systemic barriers of trust in institutions and Black-owned businesses. And we hope we'll find that out quickly. Then lastly, I'll talk about just support. The child care, transportation, and those kinds of supports are also needed for entrepreneurs. But when you package all of these together, include knowledge, include opportunities to not only get access to broadband, but understand how to use technology, how to use digital, get into the digital economy. All of these are places that relate to specific public policies that either exist or we can continue to push for that support, again, wealth building and income through business ownership. I'll close with one last remark about a barrier that we have come up against in federal public policy that I think is really something we all should be aware of and be doing something about. AEO was able to get, with the restaurant funding that came about in the federal government, we were able to get a set aside put for businesses with less than 10 employees. And we knew we were doing because we know that's where we're going to find most Black and Brown owned businesses. Pieces of the former administration sued SBA for having that set aside because it was tied to what they said was race and to Black business owners. And they won that suit. And now what we're seeing is inside this current administration, although well-intentioned, they are now scared of that. They do not want to push some of the policies that they actually believe in and tell us they support, but they are now afraid of being sued again and losing. And so it's just something as we talk about public policy, and we know we want people to be intentional around the equity inside these policies, we have to understand that that's a barrier and one that we really have to program around and think about how do we push our administration to go up against that, to stand that fight, to do whatever we have to get these policies passed so that we actually can use public policy to close the racial wealth gap. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. There's obviously so much that we're directions that we can go here. And so please do put your questions in the chat. I wanted to just sort of kick it off with one question as it relates to the narrative and, connecting to the previous panel. As I said before, I'm on the ground in New York City. I'm seeing the food pantry lines in the center of the COVID pandemic in East Elmhurst or in Queensbridge houses. And for the life of me, I cannot understand, and this goes to what Amy Castro said, how it is not the most obvious thing that people need income and they need assets. And the only way that anything is going to ever change is if those things come together. So I really would love to know from you all, each of the panelists on this panel and others, if they want to chime in, really, is really like, what is the narrative? And I know, Bill, you kind of talked about this a little bit, so maybe we can start with you. Sort of like, are there good talking points sort of to make the case around supporting wealth building policies in addition to income supports? Or, what would you advise in terms of the convincing that needs to happen? And who are you trying to convince? Any of those pieces?
Sure. So this is a really important point. And one of the things about advocacy and what I believe is important for advocates, and I don't care if you're a lobbyist like me or you're on the ground practitioner or you're in a district office or some member of Congress, the first thing that we have to do when we have an opportunity like that is know your audience. So, as to talking points vary depending on who you're talking to. So you're not gonna have the same talking point to Marjorie Taylor Greene as you would, AOC. And so, and some people, when they hear me say that, are like, well, that's dishonest. And I don't believe it's dishonest. I believe that part of what we have to do is meet people, policymakers, where they are and appeal to what we know could potentially convince them. And that's going to be a little bit different based on who they are, based on where they represent, someone in a rural area versus an urban area. There are different ways to talk about this sort of this whole range of policy initiatives that we're describing today. And so I always try to make sure that when you have an opportunity to persuade a policymaker, you've done the background work to know what their voting record may be, policies that they've supported or opposed in the past, and you use that as a frame of reference of how to persuade them of what we're trying to accomplish.
All right, Connie, we're going to flip it to you then, Signa Marie. The same question or a piece of the question.
Yeah, I think Bill is correct. AEO has 2,700 member organizations now, and we use those members to match them to their congressional at the federal level, right? To their congressional offices and the Senate offices. All politics are local, even when we're talking at the federal level, politics are still local. And so having local information, having those local organizations who provide capital, who are supporting entrepreneurship, actually go to the Hill and talk to their representatives and be able to point to, that store down the street that you shop at or something like that. We actually teach our members and send them packets out, what we call district days. So when their senators and congresspeople are home, that they can be activated and again, show up right there in their communities, taking them on tours and things like that again, kind of put whatever we know that's working in their face, talking to them locally. But also, again, let's not forget, how do we train people to do advocacy? Most organizations don't have that kind of staff capacity. And so being able to, again, kind of package information in such a way and giving people guidance around, again, here's a district day, tap, all you have to do is take the book and follow the sections. And so that's one of the ways that we've been instrumental in trying to get policy, again, local and focused with policymakers, regardless of where they are.
And I'll just add that I think it is very important to work together in an ecosystem and get evidence into the hands of people on the ground who can use it. And I think of one example there where we were providing evidence on debt and collections and student loan debt and collections to young invincibles in Texas, where licenses were being withheld if people had student loan debt and collections. And so then they could take that evidence and go to the legislator and say, you know, legislator said student loan debt and collections, that's not a problem in my jurisdiction. You know, yes, sir, it is. Here's the data on it, and with the young person speaking on it. And then Texas then overturned that law. So I think it's working together to get the evidence in the hands of people who are locally changing things. And I'll just add generally that, you know, wealth is not just for the wealthy. It's not just money in the bank, right? We've heard it's insurance against tough times. It's that tuition to get a better job, a capital or a grant for a small business. And Connie, yes, the baby trusts in DC include small business as one of the outcomes. And our random control trial evidence on match savings programs showed increase small business ownership. So those are very important in match savings, in baby trusts, in many of these different programs. But wealth is that savings to retire on. It's that springboard to the middle class, and it's what translates into opportunity. While income is needed, that's what people need to meet their basic needs. So wealth enables people to reach their full potential, which then benefits Americans of all backgrounds.
You're giving us the talking points, right? Thank you. That's great. I'm going to raise up Dr. Shanks's question that she has in the chat here. It seems easier to put money directly in the hands of families and children. How can we best support business creation and make sure business owners and entrepreneurs have access to available resources and investors? I think Connie probably can kick it to you.
Well, again, we think it's important to have grants available to businesses, not just during this pandemic, but again, recognizing the value of helping people get on a path to capital. You can't always have grants. A good business to grow will need debt, probably. They are going to need some kind of debt, but most Black and brown business owners aren't even ready for capital or taking on debt. And so what we talk about at AEO is how do we help more businesses get on a path to capital? And while they're working on their businesses, while they are learning and gaining more knowledge about where the strengths and weaknesses are and what to do about their business, why not support them with a small grant and look at helping incentivize their continued work on this path to capital so that they're building their capacity to access and then also be able to manage. I think it's also important to help investors, in particular around capital investors, address the issues of risk. What they call risk among these small businesses is not risk at all. So again, we are experimenting with new underwriting tools. One of the myths out there that we often hear is that Blacks in particular are pushed into self-employment and to business ownership. That is so not true. Again, our research just blows that myth apart. It is not true. There's one exception, and that's returning citizens, because they typically cannot get jobs in the open marketplace. Starting a business almost is a last resort for them, but they can't get capital. So again, we're working at helping to create new underwriting tools for returning citizens, entrepreneurs with prison records. And so more and more of experimentation is needed. We need to redefine risk for even our community development financial institutions. CDFIs also are, need to change how they're looking and defining risk. So some of those things that, changing the policies where we actually can give more grants, bringing in opportunities to partner with private sector, who is probably more open to giving grants, but looking at where we can infuse that in public policy as well. And then just getting this country to grapple with the issue of risk and what is really risk. A big Silicon Valley company, trust me, it's much more risky than starting that business who wants to start a bakery. We know those models, we know what they're needed, we know what it looks like. And so they're not a risky business, but we need to redefine risk as we think about how do we support more in terms of business ownership. Hopefully that answers the question that was asked here.
Thank you. Bill, Willie Elliott has a question in the chat here, which I'll read for the group here. Why can we get this done in DC? Signa Marie talked about that, but not at the federal level. So how does the narrative different in each cause such different outcomes? And then Signa Marie, what were the narratives in DC that got it across the finish line?
All right, Willie. Well, I'm a DC resident, and let me tell you, I haven't worked much around DC politics, a little bit. The difference between the DC City Council and mayor and Congress is about as stark as it could be. I mean, we have among the most progressive city council members, and have for years, racially balanced. And so, we've done things, and I actually learned a lot from the presentation today that I didn't know that were in the last DC budget. We've done things within this jurisdiction that are way out ahead of Congress. And, it makes me proud, it makes me happy. There are still problems, but this gets to the underlying point that I was making about understand the political configuration that you're trying to influence. I would say, so the sky's the limit when it comes to the DC government. Unfortunately, it's not true in Congress. And even though we're the center of the United States government, the difference between the local government here and Congress is it's dramatic and much more conservative.
And I'll just add about, what happened in DC is some of it was powerful local evidence. I mentioned that, white families in the United States have 8 times the wealth of Black families. In DC, thanks to the color of wealth study that was done, we knew the number was 81 to 1, that white families have 81 times the wealth. And so when local policymakers hear evidence about those tremendous disparities and what it means in their area, and then, like Bill said, more progressive government council member McDuffie introduced it, had experts testify. Stephen Brown and I testified from Urban Institute. Derek Hamilton testified. Many people testified. And what I hear from the federal government when I'm in the halls of Treasury and other places is that when states do things, when states can pass and role model, then with that success, then that then can move the federal government, because that can be, well, here are the examples of where it's been done, where it's been implemented, where it's been successful. That's not always enough, but it can help.
Great. If anyone has any other questions, they could put them in the chats. I will go back to one here, just Connie's very specific for you. What kind of training and certifications would be helpful for entrepreneurs at this time?
So even things like trade schools and things like that, where they're learning a different skill, and that skill gets them into a different business opportunity, is one of the places that we think about. It could also be scholarships into, again, increasing whatever their business skill is. If they get more training and information and certifications, again, it allows them to enter a different business. It might still be in, let's say, food. It could be in the food industry, where oftentimes those entrepreneurs, depending on what level, might not be making as much revenue as they could. But if they get extra training, they get other kinds of certificates where now they are moving from out of their home and into a kitchen, a commercial kitchen or something, that skill level has increased and allows them to get a license. And then with a license, they can do more. And so it varies depending on what we're talking about. But something as simple as a trade school or some other kind of certification that allows them to operate at a different level of business is what we're talking about.
Great. I hope that answers the question for the questioner. So we're going to do one last question here, and it is really going to be, some of you touched on it, but just so we can be crystal clear kind of on the closeout, one very practical policy or example of something that you think is working in your neighborhood or a neighborhood that is relevant to really both the assets and the income together, and why it really something that we can all use as a narrative to prove the case of why it's so important for both of them. And so Signa Marie, we're going to start with you, and then we'll go to Connie and then to Bill.
Yeah, so like I said, I'm very proud of what DC's done in thinking about both the guaranteed income and the baby trust, and then the individual development accounts. So that's one practical example of something that's passed. There were some limitations in bringing it down to Medicaid eligible, and there's opportunities to expand that. But that's one practical example of success. And a second, I'd say, would be the state of Michigan, since Michigan's our hosts. And there, the governor implemented asset limit reform, and so raised asset limits across 3 assistance programs: SNAP, cash assistance, and emergency relief, based on evidence that show the unintended consequences of asset limits. So those are just 2 successes that I'd leave you with and say, wealth is not just for the wealthy.
So one example that I'll point to is in New Orleans, the previous mayor applied an equity lens to their supplier inclusion programs. As you probably know, most Black-owned businesses are quite small. And so when they're trying to get contracting opportunities through any government program, who has the biggest program, right, in terms of procurement dollars to spend, most of those contracts are so big, it rules out micro business owners or even smaller, small business owners. And what we saw when equity was really the focus, they unbundled, the city government unbundled those contracts and made them smaller. It might have been more work on the city government, but it allowed many, many, many more Black-owned businesses to access procurement opportunities and become suppliers in the city government. And so it's an example that we keep trying to promote as we deal with fewer and fewer companies really looking at their supply chains to make them much more inclusive. So that's one policy making that we would suggest.
So as I often do, I'm going to end on a slightly sour note, and I want to go back to something Senator Casey said. He talked about the child tax credit and the fact that during the year in which it was expanded the way it was, we documented that child poverty was reduced by 40%, which is as dramatic a policy change that I can think of that affected that many people that quickly. So on its face, you'd think, well, heck, why wouldn't we extend it? And this is where good policy, even fact-based policy, research-based policy, evidence-based policy, run smack into politics. And in that particular case, it was one single vote from being expanded. So again, I don't want to blame people in West Virginia for the fact that Senator Manchin didn't go along with that extension, but what we do, even in the most practical senses, when we're advocating and lobbying on behalf of particular policies, is we have to be creative in finding ways that gets in the head of the people that make the decisions. And I worked with with Connie and AEO, I worked with CFED. These are research-oriented, outcome-oriented policies that they have promoted for years and years. And the frustration that I and others have felt, because the evidence is clear. I mean, the evidence is clear about IVDA. The evidence is clear about micro enterprise assistance. And yet we still can't always get through to the people that are in the best position to help. So, you know, there are a lot of, we know that there are good practical ways to achieve the goals that we want, and people are proving it every day. And so I feel like the trick here is, how do we translate that into, someone mentioned, I think it was Tom, into the power structure that exists. And say what you will about Congress, and there's a lot of ways to criticize it, but it is the only system we have. And it's the only way to get the federal government involved in this stuff. And so, and I'm not trying to blame us, but I think it is really incumbent on us to find ways to influence the people of the practical solutions that are happening all around us.
Thank you. All right, well, that is going to conclude our second charrette, and we're going to pass it over to Michael Sherraden to close out this conference.
Okay, thanks everyone. I'll try to offer a few thoughts, and I'll try to be a little bit coherent. Let me begin by saying both of these panels and the contributors were excellent. Really very rich discussions. The last panel emphasizing how to get knowledge into action, I thought was just a huge contribution. And I apologize to Connie Evans. She's right. I was overcounting by a decade or two. I'm sure she was a child prodigy, but I didn't know her at that time. But we've been working together for quite a while. So it's and also Signa Mary, let me, and Bill Zavarella, all of these folks have just been huge contributors over the years, and each of them with a strong foot in application and making something happen in the world based on knowledge. Really, all of you are role models for this work. Okay, many good contributions here. I wanna begin by going back to what I was trying to do in my framing remarks, that I think the history matters. People have always been in a position where it's kind of, until major change happens, it's kind of impossible to even imagine it. Think about the people who were at the White House Conference on Children in 1910, making a proposal to end orphanage care and support children in the community. This is not a concept that even existed. It wasn't. They imagined a very different world and actually pulled it off. And there are very few children in orphanages now, and there is support in the community. It's not, as I said, not perfect, but it was a very positive policy step forward. So people are always in this position. It will always seem impossible. So no need to feel special about that. It's not different than it ever has been. And still, at some times in the past, people have been able to create new policy directions. And I bring this up, Will. I think Willie's comment about this is really relevant here. If we look at how difficult it is, it's easily to be frozen, and it's easy to. It can easily lead to inaction. Like, what can we possibly do? So I would like us to, as much as we can, reject that. There will be, like Sandy Darity is, my role model in this regard. Sandy makes proposals that are for reparations and for jobs for everyone, that are like way out there. And I have never seen him be daunted by political reality. And so to some extent, we have to adopt that stance. It's the only way we can get something done. So then our job is to envision and to ask ourselves, well, what can we envision and put in place? This becomes a very practical matter. And in this regard, and going back to my comments in the beginning, a ton of money is on the table. It's not like there are not resources in the United States, even in the existing policy structure, that can't pay for a lot of stuff. But as clear here, we all know from our careers and comments at this meeting, this money is not directed in the best possible way. And I think we have to take that on head on. And I think that includes direct expenditures and the tax expenditures. If you know, $100+ billion a year is spent on the home mortgage interest tax deduction, somebody should be asking, well, is that a sensible housing policy in America? A lot of us live in cities where a lot of people have no shelter. So wouldn't it be better to say, well, if we're spending $100 billion a year, that's just at the federal level, for housing policy benefits, we're talking about cash benefits, why not give every household the same amount? That would be fair. That's not even progressive, that's just fair. So then we could ask, well, why don't we be progressive? Some people don't really need a housing benefit. Why don't we give a little more to people who really need it? So there is so much opportunity for major change if we envision and frame the questions in the right way. And definitely the home mortgage interest tax deduction should be framed as, what is our policy for shelter in America? And that should apply to not just homeowners, but renters as well. Like, why do we privilege homeowners for tax benefits and not renters? There's just there's just a lot that can happen, but it takes a vision, and it takes a lot of hard work. And as I love Bill's example of, the progressive proposal early in his career, very, very, idealistic, expansive proposal that's not going to, everyone knew could not pass, but yet put these kinds of questions on the table. So with that said, I think in my view, a policy North Star that is implied in a lot of this discussion is that we should aim for putting everyone in the same policy structures. Even if these structures don't currently exist, we should aim to create them. We know from a lot of historical experience that if we allow wealthy people to have their benefits, and then we talk about special programs for people who are poor, or even people of color, or whatever our category is, we know that these programs for poor people, this is an old saying in policy, will always be poor programs. And I think we have to face that clearly, and our goal should be put everyone in the same policy structures, and then be progressive, sure, but don't have special programs that give a little bit of money over here to poor people, because this is not a winning policy strategy, and plenty of evidence historically documents that. Okay, so I'll make a few other key points. I really loved having Amy Castro on the panel. Really strong leadership in testing and moving universal income policies forward. And I think that whole area of work, it really is on the table. And I was really encouraged in the last year, even though the child tax credit did not become permanent. This is the first example of a child allowance in American social policy. I mean, America really stands out in this regard. Almost every country has a child allowance, but we don't. But this was a very positive step. It did not get renewed. It did not get made permanent, but this policy now has a foothold in American policy discourse, and I think should be built upon, as should all of these proposals for basic income as a right. Even though it seems like a radical idea to us now, it could easily be in the future that it's just accepted. That, of course, there should be child allowances. Of course, every household should have a basic income. So let's not lose sight of that possibility. I like Willie's framing of having public policies that promote not just survival, but I think Willie framed it today in terms of pursuing happiness. And I think we take that in a large meaning, pursuing development, pursuing your life goals, being able to live your life as effectively as possible. And that framing for asset building policy is really, really fundamental. In that regard, and that connects then to the next point that Willie also made about especially for asset policies, getting beyond small dollar amounts. And I think we all agree about that. I would say that the original proposal for starting accounts for all children in 1991 that I wrote did have an example that suggested amounts of money that would go into these accounts. And I did a little calculation about what those amounts of money would be in today's dollars. And in today's dollar, that proposal was $28,000 per child growing up. So that's quite a bit different from the child development account language that we're talking about now. And even more than some of the proposals for baby bonds. We're talking about, I believe we've always been talking about a substantial amount of money. And it's one of the reasons that I prefer the term child development account to child savings account is that too often people have misinterpreted the words child savings account to be about improving people's savings behavior. And this really gets our discussion way off track. Of course, we should try to improve people's savings behavior, but low-income people are not going to save enough to improve given their incomes, to improve their situation substantially. This has to be a public policy. There have to be real resources that go into these accounts. So I think we should be careful about language we use and how we frame this and what it's about. And in my view, this is about building assets, not improving savings behavior. Of course, we will always be in favor of saving, but it is not enough. Okay, so then this gets back to it. I really like the last panel. Really, a lot of these are good folks who have been working to try to put something in place. So Bill and Connie and Mary's observations about making these policy advancements in their career, talking about, well, you have to think through a good policy design. It's not enough to just have an idea. There has to be a policy design that you can actually put in place. I think another standard for this is a policy design that you can put in place and will be sustainable. This is a high bar, and it's not good enough to just say, oh, I think we should give this amount of money to this group. We really have to know how that will work and how it will be put in place, who will run it, will it be effective, and will it be sustainable over time? These are practical policy standards that can't be separated from this discussion. So I think there are really good examples provided here. I believe that we have in child development accounts been working on a practical policy design. It has some shortcomings, but we have put it in place in a number of states now. It is on a sustainable policy platform. It has bipartisan support. So these kind of practical policy issues for getting something in place are terrifically important. Switching topics a little bit, I really liked both. I think Willie brought up that we should pay attention to employment policies as well, and Connie brought up business ownership not only as a path to job creation, but as a path to building wealth. These are reframings that I think are terrifically important. Employment income, whether it's you're self-employed or you're getting working for a wage, it's really the hugest part of household income. And it probably always will be. It can't really be off the table here. And so we haven't talked about it much because it's not a popular policy theme now. But there have been times in the past when people did propose a major public employment programs. The Biden administration their credit, has proposed what are they calling a civilian climate corps. This is borrowing from the Civilian Conservation Corps of the 1930s, which was very successful employment program during those years. I did my doctoral dissertation on this topic. I really believe that there should be, you know, a lot more public employment, and I think liberals tend to frame this as employment of last resort. I think that's language we should definitely drop. Why don't we call this language of first resort? You know, all the members of Congress are public employees. Supreme Court justices are public employees. Why don't we honor public employment and not call it a last resort opportunity? Definitely, there's plenty of work to do in environmental issues and in social care and in other areas that it's worth investing in. And this should be a public policy issue as well. We didn't cover it here. It's not a criticism, but I just think that if we're thinking about the large topic of economic security, this also has to be on the table. In this regard, I think, tip of the hat to Frances Perkins in the 1930s, another social worker Frances Perkins, probably the chief architect of the Social Security Act and the chief architect of the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1935. These are probably the two most important pieces of legislation in American history. And I mean, someday she will be elevated to the position she deserves in American policy history. These are massive contributions. And Frances Perkins, you know, laid the groundwork for jobs that are fair to people with working conditions that don't harm people or minimize those harms, and enough compensation that they can support families. This is the precursors to a lot more work that must lie ahead. I'd like to also make a comment about race. This has come up several times in this topic. I think to some extent we can be a little bit encouraged about the recognition of race in American history. It's been a rocky period in America trying to come to terms with race, and we have a lot of setbacks, and we had them in the last few days, tragic setbacks. But at the same time, you know, it's not the first time this has happened, and we have to be cautious about, you know, will it disappear again? But the lynching of George Floyd really did start a discussion in America about what are we doing here? And I think this should be built on. And again, we can tip our hand to Sandy Darity's work and on reparations and other people working on this topic of putting these big ideas back on the table. Something, you know, America was built on racial harms. I mean, these are huge facts, especially to Native people and to enslaved Africans, but also to Hispanics and the Chinese in American history. And I don't want to minimize the harm to any group, but these are harms that have to be dealt with, and they are now just a little bit poking out from under the rug, you know, the historical rug that has covered them up. And I think we can be hopeful about this, and we should continue to push. This will be a long process. But this is an area of policy that America must cope with if we're going to be a successful nation going forward. And I think this policy discussion has only just begun. And in that regard, I think there's reason for hope. There's also a lot of reason for a lot of hard work. A couple of other points that I think matter. Let me give a tip of the hat to Trina here. Trina plays many roles, but she's one of the national leaders now in the grand challenges for social work, and she leads one of the grand challenges with other people called reducing extreme economic inequality. So taking on this is in her own academic realm of applied research in social work. But all of us sit in some positions where we can take on some national role in leadership, and this also matters for framing discussions, putting policy agendas on the table, and moving forward. So this is we can take Trina as an example of using her role to do that. And all really, this is an amazing group of people at this meeting. All of us sit in positions where we will have opportunities to speak with a larger voice by joining these efforts. And I think that has to be part of this process. Finally, this is maybe not the most important topic, but and this is a little bias on my part. I really believe that applied social research, and there are a lot of examples of it in the discussion today, really plays a major role in public policy formation. A lot of times we don't talk about it that way, but the examples that we have today from Signa Mary's examples in DC, Bill's discussions about applied research knowledge, it's not that it automatically translates into public policy, but this evidence really does matter. Amy's research, really a very impressive research project tracking the basic income policies around the country. This is going to matter a lot. I think that our research on child development accounts, we're running a long-term experiment called Seed for Oklahoma Kids with a lovely experiment. It's been going on for 15 years, and the evidence from this experiment has directly informed child development account policies in America, and really in lots of other countries. So we end up working a lot internationally, really based on that research project. So I think that we should not underestimate the value of applied research testing innovations, and I want to put a lot of emphasis on this. It's my own bias, I admit, but I think a lot more applied social research should be testing ideas in the world. It's not really enough to do research that points out disparities. Of course, we have disparities, and it's good to document them. But if we're really interested as applied researchers, then we would also be trying to think about how do we take these disparities or knowledge of these disparities and design an effective policy that can be put in place to reduce those disparities. And I think that also is a very high bar. It's kind of underestimated how high that bar is. It's not easy, but people have done it in the past. There are many examples in this meeting today of people doing exactly this, and I think we should elevate this work more than we have as one essential pathway to policy. We tend to talk about, for example, children's accounts policy. A lot of the language that gets used is that this is part of a movement, or there's political language used. It is. It's true, and I'm delighted that it has this political content. But the engine that actually drives this policy, or that makes possible this policy, is that there's good basic research that documents positive effects of. And Tom raises the important question, and a really important question of why do we have to document this? And of course, we all ask this question all the time. Why do we have to document that? Well, these policies can really work for everyone, not just for rich people. And I think Tom's right. This is about power. But if we don't hold this power, then we have to take the avenues that we have. And the evidence, I really believe the evidence can matter. And as a closing thought, trying to tie this all together, I think that evidence matters. It's always messy. It's always a hard fight. My wife just brought me a note saying time's up, so I'll finish. It's always a hard fight, but if we have the evidence, it's possible at the right moment. And here we need the wisdom of Bill and Mary and others who work closely with the policy process. That at the right time, it's possible to make progress with this evidence. And then I'm reminded, a long time ago, I was talking to Michael Barr, and Michael just got a major appointment from the Biden administration to be back in government. It's a good thing. He's a wonderful policy advocate. He's going to be overseeing banking in America, which needs a little oversight. Michael said, well, I think I was whining about how hard it is to get anything done. And Michael said to me, and I think he quoted Abraham Lincoln, something to the effect that the nature of politics is that you need one more vote than the other side. It is always messy. It is always a fight, but what you need is one more vote. And in that regard, all the wisdom that was presented in the last panel about, well, you have to talk to legislators where they are. You have to get her or him to see the point from his perspective or her perspective that they might support this bill. So that's hard work. That's a lot of hard work. It's not work that I do, but our, we have colleagues who do that. And so I just want to leave that notion in place here. Of course, all of this is impossible, but you just need one more vote than the other side. Deborah knows this, working in the city politics in New York City. So that probably I've said too much already. So I'm late, so I'll sign off, and thank you all for a really wonderful session today.
I don't know where it's going. So thank you. So thanks everyone. Thanks Michael for the great wisdom and words, and thanks all the panelists, but also thank you everybody who attended, because otherwise we're just talking to ourselves, and you're the ones who are actually going to take this out there, carry it on, so we can actually have some of this narrative change that we've talked about, so that we can get that one more vote that Michael's talking about. Without that narrative change, it's just not going to happen. So please go out, tweet, share what you've learned here, and take it forward and carry it forward so we can actually see this in our lifetimes. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Kauffman Foundation. Thanks, everybody.